Rain came down on Farley Hall that night, as though the sky itself meant to wash away a wrong long buried. In a long candlelit room in Fenbridge, where drafts slipped beneath the door and made the flames tremble, a young woman in a rain-soaked cloak stood before the men who held the power to judge her. Her hands shook. Her eyes did not. Behind her, two enormous gray hounds growled low in their throats, as if they too were waiting on a verdict. 3 months before, she had been no one in particular a maid carrying a basket of wet linen down a cold kitchen corridor. Neither she nor anyone else in that corridor had known that her story had begun 20 years earlier, in a hanging that should never have taken place, in a sum of money that had vanished without a trace, and in a name struck from a ledger by one deliberate black line of ink. At the far end of the room, the Duke stood without moving, his eyes never leaving her, as though the whole of his family's honor now depended on what she was about to say. In another corner, a man kept his composure, and his small, even smile the smile of someone who believed that truth, like grain in a starving year, could be locked behind a granary door and left there forever. No one in that room yet knew how the night would end. But to understand how a penniless maid came to stand at the center of a hearing that would decide the fate of an entire estate, the story must go back to an unseasonably cold summer morning, when the Duke's two wolfhounds broke free of their kennel and tore the silk hem from the gown of a young lady who had arrived at Farley Hall dreaming of a duchess's coronet. The sun that July morning rose the color of a tarnished shilling, dimmed by a strange dry haze that had lain over the county since June. The almanacs called it an unlucky year. The tenant farmers, watching frost-blackened beanstalks that ought to have been in full flower, called it something closer to a judgment, though none of them could have said against whom. Nathaniel Deverell, 7th Duke of Hallowdene, had given up trying to explain it to his steward's satisfaction and had instead resigned himself to riding out before breakfast, so that he might see with his own eyes what the frost had taken in the night. He was still in his riding coat, boots unbrushed, when the commotion reached him from the direction of the rose garden. It began, as these things generally did, with a scream. "They bit me!" Lady Philippa Grey's voice carried the particular pitch of a woman more wounded in her dignity than in her person, and by the time Nathaniel reached the garden, the damage was already done. A torn flounce, a ruined slipper, and two identical hounds sitting some 10 feet away with an air of profound satisfaction, as though they had merely been asked to fetch something and had performed the task admirably. Ajax, Hector Nathaniel did not raise his voice. He rarely needed to. Both hounds looked at him, tails going still, ears half lowered in something that might have been contrition and might equally have been boredom with the whole affair. "Your Grace." Lady Philippa's mother had arrived, color high, already composing the account she would give at 3 separate dinner tables before the week was out. "Your animals are a menace. A young lady cannot be expected to." "I am aware, Lady Grey, and I am entirely sorry for it." He was. He said it plainly, without the flourish that might have made it sound like flattery, because flattery was a currency he had grown tired of spending. "I will have Mrs. Hollis see to the gown." It was, by the housekeeper's private reckoning, the 4th young lady this year to leave Farley Hall with a piece of her wardrobe worse for wear. Nathaniel had stopped asking why. He had begun, instead, to suspect that his hounds possessed a judgment sharper than his own, for it was always the same sort of lady who suffered this fate, young, ambitious, and dressed in scent, strong enough to announce her arrival from the drive. He watched the gray carriage depart with the particular relief of a man who had once again been spared a conversation he did not wish to have, and told himself, not for the first time, that a duke in want of an heir ought to feel more urgency about the matter than he did. Ajax leaned his considerable weight against Nathaniel's leg and sighed, as if to say the matter was well in hand. "You are no help to me," Nathaniel told him, and scratched behind one gray ear regardless. The rest of the morning offered less charm and more arithmetic. In his study, the estate's steward, Mr. Obadiah Sharp, was waiting with the week's accounts laid out in his careful, sloping hand, a hand so neat that Nathaniel had once remarked, half in jest, that it belonged more properly to a bishop than a land agent. Sharp had merely smiled at that. In the mild, patient way he smiled at most things, and said that a steward who could not keep an honest ledger was of no use to anyone. The Sedgefen wheat is all but lost. Your Grace, Sharp said now, without looking up from the page. 2 more fields blackened in the night. I have written to the corn factor in Fenbridge, though I confess I hold little hope of a fair price, given the new duty on foreign grain. And our own people? I have increased the flour allowance to the tenant cottages, as we discussed. Sharp's pen moved down the column, unhurried. Though I must remind your Grace that charity, however well meant, cannot outlast an empty granary. You said something very like that to my mother once, I recall, Nathaniel said, more from idle memory than any particular purpose. The year of the bad harvest, before I was out of short coats. She used to say you were the one steady thing in the house that year. Her Grace was very kind in her remembering. Sharp's pen did not pause. It was a difficult season for the whole estate. I am glad to have been of use to her, then as now. Nathaniel let the matter drop, as he generally did with anything belonging to a period of his life. He remembered only in fragments a fever, a funeral, his mother's black gloves, and little else besides. It was not a season he had any wish to revisit, and Sharp, to his credit, never pressed him to. It was sound advice, delivered as it always was, in a voice that made prudence sound like the only decent course a man could take. Nathaniel had relied on that voice for 7 years, ever since he had come of age, and taken the estate fully into his own hands, and he had never once had cause to doubt it. He did not doubt it now. He merely found himself, for reasons he could not entirely name, watching Sharp's pen a moment longer than the figures required. Outside, beyond the study window, Ajax and Hector had already lost interest in penance and were engaged in a vigorous debate over a dead branch. Nathaniel watched them for a moment before returning to the ledger, and did not yet know that within a fortnight, one of those 2 hounds would do more to unsettle his household than any bad harvest ever had. Verity Marsh had been at Farley Hall 3 days, and in that time she had learned more about the price of bread than she had in the whole of the previous year. Ninepence the quartern loaf and rising, Cook said, for perhaps the 5th time that week, as though repeating the figure might somehow shame it into coming down. In my mother's day, a laboring man could feed his family on his wages and think nothing of it. Now Parliament passes its precious corn law to keep the foreign wheat out, and the price of English wheat high. And who does that serve, I ask you? Not the man behind this stove, I can tell you that. Verity did not answer, because she had learned already that Cook's questions were not questions so much as whether, to be endured rather than answered. She kept scrubbing the pot in front of her, and thought, as she often did lately, that hunger had a way of following her, regardless of where she went from the cramped rooms she had shared with her mother in a market town, 2 counties distant, to this vast kitchen, with its blackened rafters and its endless anxious talk of harvests. She had come to Farley Hall through the registry office in the county town, one respectable address among several she had visited in the fortnight after her last position ended, and she had thought nothing of it beyond gratitude that a house so grand should have work for a girl with no family to vouch for her beyond a dead mother's good name. She did not know that the name Deverell meant anything to her beyond the wages it promised. She had no memory of the county at all, having left it, by all accounts, before she was a 12-month old. Positions had not come easily that year. With the war against Bonaparte concluded the summer before, the registry office had been crowded with soldiers' widows and disbanded men's daughters, all offering the same modest accomplishments to the same shrinking number of households willing to take on new staff in a season of failed harvests. Verity had counted herself fortunate to be offered Farley Hall at all, and had not thought to ask why so grand a house should have need of another scullery maid when half the parish stood ready to take the place for less. Her mother had never spoken of it. Susanna Marsh had been a careful woman in most things, but on the matter of where they had lived before the 2 of them arrived in Lincolnshire, she had been careful in a different way, the way of someone guarding a wound rather than a secret worth telling. When Verity had asked, as children do, her mother would only say that they had come from the fens once, and that the fens were no place for a young girl to grow up hungry, and that was the end of it. Verity had been 15 when her mother died, and 5 years had taught her to stop asking questions that only opened old wounds. She had learned instead to be useful quietly, thoroughly useful, because a girl without connections had little else to offer a household, and usefulness, unlike beauty or breeding, could not be taken from her. "You there, Mrs. Hollis," the housekeeper, appeared in the doorway, with the particular briskness of a woman who had run this household for 20 years and intended to run it for 20 more. "Finish that pot and see to the good linen in the drawing room. And mind you keep well clear of the kennels this morning. His Grace's hounds are in a temper." "Are they dangerous, ma'am?" "Only," said Mrs. Hollis, with the ghost of something that might, in a less careful woman, have been a smile, to young ladies of a certain sort. Verity thought little more of the warning. She had never had cause to fear dogs. Her mother had kept a fondness for them that Verity had inherited without quite understanding why, a fondness that showed itself now only in small habits, a particular blend of dried lavender and rosemary that Verity sewed into a linen sachet and kept in her apron pocket because her mother had once told her, in one of her rare unguarded moments, that the scent had always calmed frightened animals, and that a girl ought to carry a little calm about her in a world so short of it. It was a small superstition, and Verity had never once thought to test its truth. She had reason to reconsider that before the week was out. Beyond the kitchen window, she could see the beginnings of a queue at the estate's flower store tenant wives and their children, waiting on the steward's ration with the patient, hollow-eyed look of people who had already learned not to expect too much. It was the same look Verity remembered from her own childhood, in years when the harvest failed and the parish relief did not stretch far enough. The parish vestry in Lincolnshire had always been generous with its promises and slow with its shillings, topping up a laborer's wages according to the price of the loaf and the size of his family, in the manner every parish in England had adopted since the troubles of the last century, and Verity had learned early that a promise of relief and the arrival of relief were two very different animals. However closely they were meant to resemble one another on paper, she wondered, not for the first time, whether any summer in England ever truly delivered what its spring had promised. The hounds came through the kitchen door with no more warning than a bang and a scatter of startled hens from the yard beyond. Verity had heard of them. Of course, every servant in the house had an opinion on Ajax and Hector, the Duke's Irish wolfhounds, who were said to have ruined more fine gowns than the county's dressmakers could easily mend. She had pictured, from the talk, something closer to wolves than dogs. What came through the door instead were two enormous gray shapes, chests broad as barrels, heads that came near to her own waist, moving with a silence that seemed at odds with their size. The kitchen maid nearest the hearth scrambled onto a stool with a shriek. Cook seized a rolling pin as though it might serve as a weapon. Verity, caught halfway between the drying room and the scullery, with a basket of linen on her hip, had no time to do anything but stand still. The larger of the two hounds, Ajax, though she did not yet know his name, came toward her first, in no great hurry, his nose working. He stopped close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath through her apron, and there, quite without ceremony, he pressed his great head against the pocket where she kept her mother's sachet, and made a low sound in his chest that was not quite a growl. Verity's pulse hammered somewhere in her throat. She thought of Mrs. Hollis's warning, of torn gowns and furious young ladies, and stood very still, the basket forgotten in her arms. Then Ajax sighed an enormous, gusting sigh, as though some private question had at last been answered to his satisfaction, and sat down at her feet. The second hound did not wait for permission. He shoved past his brother, buried his nose directly in her apron pocket, with an enthusiasm entirely unbecoming of a creature his size, and began wagging a tail long enough to threaten the crockery on the nearest shelf. Hector, get away from her. This from a footman by the door, though he made no move to help, which Verity thought, in the small distant part of her mind still capable of thought, was rather typical of footmen. She laughed before she could stop herself, a short, startled sound, and without quite deciding to, reached down and scratched behind Hector's ear. He groaned with pleasure and leaned his whole weight into her hand. The kitchen, which a moment before had been a chorus of alarm, fell into a silence thick enough to touch. It was into that silence that the Duke of Hallowdene stepped through the doorway, his hounds had left open, and stopped. For a moment, no one moved. 2 hounds notorious across 3 parishes were arranged at the feet of a scullery maid, as though she were visiting royalty, and every soul in the kitchen seemed to be waiting for someone else to explain it. "I don't know them, Your Grace," Verity said at last, because it seemed the only honest thing to say, and because his gray eyes had settled on her with an attention that made the statement feel, absurdly, like something she ought to apologize for. "Evidently," he said, "they disagree." He came further into the kitchen, and if he found the scene as strange as everyone else plainly did, he hid it well behind the same composed civility he wore. Verity would learn, over most things. "That is Ajax." The larger hound thumped his tail once at the sound of his name. "And the one currently attempting to climb into your apron is Hector. He seems very determined, Your Grace. He generally is. The staff call them trouble and treason, though never within my hearing." Something in his expression eased not quite a smile, but its nearer relation. "You are new to the house. 3 days, Your Grace." Verity Marsh. She dropped a belated curtsy, aware of how thoroughly she had forgotten herself in the last several minutes. "Miss Marsh." He said it slowly, as though turning the name over for some private reason of his own, though Verity could not imagine what reason a duke might have for it. Then, before she could wonder further, he looked down at his hounds, Ajax pressed to her skirts, Hector still shamelessly rooting in her apron pocket, and something in his face settled, as if a decision she had not known was being weighed had just been made. "It seems," he said, "you have acquired 2 new duties, Miss Marsh, whether either of us intended it or not." By supper time, the servants' hall had produced 3 separate explanations for what had occurred in the kitchen, and disputed all 3 with equal conviction. The scullery boy held that Miss Marsh possessed some rare gift for taming beasts, a notion he supported by pointing out that she had once coaxed a broody hen off its nest without being pecked, which he considered conclusive. The senior footman preferred a simpler theory, that the hounds, denied their dinner that morning on account of cook's temper, had mistaken Miss Marsh's basket for something edible, and would very likely have shown the same devotion to a joint of mutton left standing in the same spot. Cook herself, who had lived at Farley Hall longer than anyone below the rank of housekeeper, offered no theory at all, only the observation, delivered darkly over the evening's washing up, that dogs generally knew things people did not, and that it was wiser not to go asking them what. Verity, for her part, found she preferred the footman's explanation. It felt safer, somehow, to be mistaken for mutton than to be the object of anything a person might feel obliged to investigate. Not every servant took the matter so lightly. There was, among the older maids, a current of something closer to envy a new girl of no family, and 3 days' standing, elevated above the scullery in a single morning, was not the sort of turn of fortune a household of 40 years' service easily forgave. Verity felt it in the sudden coolness of a curtsy, the deliberate slowness with which her request for hot water was answered, and understood, without needing to be told, that whatever goodwill the hounds had bought her would have to be earned twice over from everyone else. She thought little of it that first evening. She had weathered smaller unkindnesses than a servant's hall's cold shoulder, and told herself that a fortnight of quiet diligence would mend what one strange morning had disturbed. She did not yet know that the hound's affection was the smallest of the disturbances she had brought with her to Farley Hall. Nathaniel had not planned, when he woke that morning, to alter the arrangement of his household before noon. But there was something in the sight of Ajax, a hound, who had bitten a viscount's daughter only the previous spring and shown no remorse whatsoever, sitting in patient devotion at a kitchen maid's feet that struck him as too rare a thing to leave to chance. Effective today, he told her, once Mrs. Hollis had been summoned, and the matter explained as best it could be explained, which was not very well. You are relieved of your other duties. You will see to the hounds feeding, walking, and whatever else keeps them from destroying my mother's rose beds. Miss Marsh's face, he noted, showed rather more alarm at this promotion than gratitude. Your Grace, I know nothing of hounds beyond what any farm girl knows. They appear to know rather more of you than that. He had not meant it to sound as strange aloud as it did, and cleared his throat. It is not a request, Miss Marsh. Consider it settled. He left her to Mrs. Hollis's capable, if visibly bewildered, management, and returned to his study with the odd, unsettled feeling of a man who has just made a decision for reasons he cannot entirely defend. It was not, he told himself, so very unusual. He had held the title since he was 6 years old, when his father died of a putrid fever, a boy too young to remember more than the shape of a voice and the weight of a hand on his shoulder. But a title was not the same as a hand on the reins, and it was not until he came of age at 21 that Farley Hall had passed fully into his own keeping. In the 14 years between, his mother had managed the estate alone, a widow of 28 left with a small son, a large house, and a steward she had been obliged, in her grief and her inexperience, to trust rather more completely than perhaps she ought. Nathaniel did not often let his thoughts run in that direction. It served no purpose, he had always believed, to question arrangements that had kept Farley Hall solvent and orderly for 2 decades, least of all the diligence of a man as steady as Obadiah Sharp. And yet, sitting now at his desk with the estate ledgers open before him, he found himself thinking of his mother's later years, of a certain restlessness that had come over her in the last year of her life, letters half-written and never sent, a habit of standing at the window of the old records room as though watching for someone who never came. He had been 20 then, still a year from taking the estate into his own hands, and too raw in his own grief to think of asking her what troubled her. She had died the following spring, and the question, whatever it had been, had died with her. He shook the thought off, as he always did, and turned his attention back to the wheat. He did not think of it again until a week later, on an afternoon when the hounds dragged both him and Miss Marsh down a path he had not walked since boyhood. The first walk was arranged, with a formality Verity found faintly absurd, for 4 o'clock that same afternoon, on the south lawn, with 2 leather leads misses. Hollis had produced from some drawer that seemed to contain a solution for every possible household crisis. "Keep them well clear of the drive, if any callers come, missus," Hollis instructed, tying the last knot with brisk efficiency. "And keep them clear of Mr. Sharp's office window. He does not care for the noise. Mr. Sharp, ma'am? The land steward. You'll meet him soon enough, everyone does, sooner or later." Something in the housekeeper's tone made Verity glance up, but Mrs. Hollis had already turned away to scold a footman about a smudged window pane, and the moment passed. She met him within the hour. He came across the lawn as she was attempting, with limited success, to prevent Hector from investigating a gardener's abandoned wheelbarrow, and introduced himself with a bow precisely correct in its depth, not so shallow as to slight her position, not so deep as to suggest she merited more courtesy than a servant was owed. "Mr. Sharp," he said, "I manage his Grace's estate accounts, among other things. You must be the new girl the hounds have taken such a fancy to. The whole house is talking of nothing else. I confess I don't understand it myself, sir. Nor, I imagine, does anyone." His smile was pleasant, his voice mild, and yet Verity found herself unable to shake the sense of being weighed, the way a merchant might weigh a coin whose stamp looked slightly wrong. "Dogs are simple creatures, Miss Marsh. They generally attach themselves to whoever feeds them, or whoever smells of something they liked once. I shouldn't read too much into it were I you." He might have left the matter there, and very likely intended to, for he had already half turned toward the house before he seemed to reconsider, and turned back. "You have people in the county, Miss Marsh?" he asked, in the same easy tone he might have used to remark on the weather. "It is unusual, a girl finding her way to Farley Hall from so far off, with no connection to recommend her." "None that I know of, sir. My mother's people were from somewhere near these fens, I believe. She died before I thought to ask exactly where." "Did she?" Something in his face did not change so much as settle, the way still water settles, after a stone has already sunk beneath it. A common enough story in these parts. The fens have swallowed a great many families whole, one way or another, these 20 years past. He smiled again, the same pleasant, unhurried smile. "You'll forgive my curiosity. A steward learns to keep track of who comes and goes on an estate such as this. It is generally the dullest part of the work." It was sensible advice, offered in a sensible tone, and Verity could not have said afterward why it left her faintly uneasy, except that his eyes, while he said it, had gone once briefly, and only once to the pocket of her apron, where she kept her mother's little sachet, before returning to her face as though they had never strayed at all. "Of course, sir," she said, and thought no more of it, because there was, as yet, nothing to think. The Duke arrived a few minutes later, in riding clothes rather than the coat he had worn that morning, and Sharp took his leave of them both with the same correct bow, murmuring something about the corn factor's letter needing an answer before the post went out. Verity watched him go and told herself that a land steward, of all people, had every right to be curious about a new servant who had turned the household so thoroughly upside down in the space of a single morning. They walked in the direction of the old quarry copse, the hounds ranging ahead and doubling back with the restless energy of creatures who considered a lead an insult tolerated only out of affection for the person holding it. The Duke said little at first, and Verity, mindful of her place, said less, keeping half a step behind him and her eyes on the path. "You need not walk behind me, Miss Marsh," he said eventually, without turning. "The hounds do not observe the distinction, and I confess I have never seen the sense of it myself. It is what is proper, your grace, so I am told. Frequently, there was something dry in it that might, in a more talkative man, have been closer to humor. My mother used to say that propriety was a fine thing until it made a house feel like a church." I never quite decided whether she meant it as praise or complaint. Verity said nothing, unsure what a maid was meant to say to a duke's private memories of his mother, and instead watched Ajax attempt, with great dignity, to steal a stick twice his own length from beneath a hedge. "You are not from Norfolk," he said, after a silence that did not feel unkind. "Your speech. Lincolnshire, your grace, though I understand my mother's people came from somewhere near these fens. Once, she never said where exactly. It was more than she generally offered strangers, and she was not certain why she had offered it now, except that the afternoon light and the dog's easy company had loosened something in her that 3 days of scrubbing pots had not. Then perhaps the fens remember her, even if you do not," he said, lightly enough that she took it for nothing more than a pleasantry, and let it pass. "May I ask your grace something forward? You have already asked one question this afternoon that several duchesses of my acquaintance would consider forward, Miss Marsh. I doubt a second will undo either of us. Is it true they have bitten a dozen young ladies this year alone? 4, by my housekeeper's count, though the story does tend to grow a pair of legs and run off on its own by the time it reaches the next parish." Something almost like amusement crossed his face. "I am told the county has begun to speak of Ajax and Hector as though they were a pair of particularly discerning matchmakers. I have stopped correcting the notion. It saves a great deal of tedious conversation at dinner. And does your grace believe it? That they are discerning?" He was quiet long enough that she wondered if she had, after all, gone too far. "I believe," he said finally, "that a man in my position hears a great many opinions about who would suit him, and precious few of them from anyone with no interest in the answer. My hounds, at least, want nothing from me but their dinner and a fire to lie beside. There is something to be said for an opinion with no object behind it." Verity considered this and found she had no ready reply that would not presume too much on so short an acquaintance, and so said nothing at all, and was glad when Ajax chose that moment to lunge after a startled rabbit and spare her the necessity of finding one. They did not speak again until the hounds, without the warning, pulled hard toward a narrow track, leading away from the quarry copse and into the older, untended part of the estate, and it was there, some minutes later, that the afternoon's easy mood gave way to something Verity could not at the time have named. The track dipped beneath a stand of ancient oaks whose roots had buckled the path into ridges, and the air there turned suddenly cooler, damper, as though the summer itself had been asked to wait outside. Ahead, half swallowed by ivy, stood a small stone cottage with a faded green door and windows gone dark with years of neglect. The hounds slowed at the sight of it. Whatever restless energy had carried them across the lawn and through the copse seemed to drain away entirely. Ajax's ears went back, and Hector, for the first time that afternoon, stopped pulling at his lead altogether. "What is this place, your grace?" "The old gardener's cottage." Nathaniel had stopped as well, his gaze fixed on the green door, with an expression Verity could not quite read. "It has stood empty as long as I can remember. Longer. I think my mother would never permit anyone to let it out, though I never learned why. Ajax approached the threshold and began to sniff at the weeds grown thick around it, low and methodical, the way Verity imagined a hound might search for something it had lost long ago and had not entirely given up hope of finding. Hector pressed his nose flat against the door itself and let out a single soft whine. Something in Verity's chest tightened without her understanding why. A green door, the particular smell of damp stone and old ivy. For half a heartbeat, she had the sensation gone before she could hold on to it of rain against a window pane, and a hand closing tightly around her own small one, and a voice she could no longer place saying something she could not hear. It vanished as quickly as it came, leaving only the ordinary cottage, the ordinary ivy, and two hounds behaving as though they had found a grave. "They never come here," Nathaniel said quietly. "In 7 years I have walked this path perhaps a dozen times, and they have always avoided it as though it did not exist." Ajax scratched once, deliberately, at the base of the door, and the sound scraped through Verity in a way she did not care to examine. "Perhaps," she said, more to fill the silence than because she believed it, "there is a rabbit's warren beneath it, your grace, and nothing more. Perhaps." He did not sound as though he believed it either. He watched his hounds a moment longer, and then, in the brisk manner of a man setting aside a thought he had no ready use for, gathered Ajax's lead and turned back toward the house. "We should return before the light goes. Mrs. Hollis will have opinions if her linen is not seen to before supper." Verity followed, glancing back once at the green door before the Oaks closed over it. She told herself, as she had told herself about the sachet and the sudden fondness of two notorious hounds, that there was very likely a perfectly ordinary explanation for all of it, that old houses collected old smells the way old women collected old grievances, and that neither generally amounted to anything a sensible person needed to lose sleep over. She almost believed it, all the way back to the kitchen. That night, lying awake in the narrow bed beneath the eaves that had been hers, for exactly 3 days, Verity took the little linen sachet from her apron pocket, where it had lain all day against two hounds who did not know her, in a house she had never before set foot in a county her mother had fled and never once named. She turned it over in her fingers, breathing in the faint scent of lavender and rosemary that had followed her, unremarked, through every position she had ever held. It had never once before made a stranger's dog behave as though it recognized her. She told herself it meant nothing, and did not sleep well regardless. 2 floors below, in the room that had been his father's and was now his own, Nathaniel Deverell was no more inclined to sleep than his newest servant. He lay with his hands folded behind his head, watching the dark ceiling, and turned over, for the first time in years, the memory of his mother, standing at the window of the old records room, waiting for a caller who never arrived. He did not know why the sight of 2 hounds, refusing to cross an old cottage threshold, should have called that memory back to him so forcefully, except that grief, he had found, rarely announced itself before it arrived. It simply waited, patient as Sharp's neat handwriting, for the smallest excuse to surface again. He resolved, before sleep finally took him, to ask Mrs. Hollis in the morning what she remembered of the cottage, and told himself it was nothing more than idle curiosity. He was, by nature, not a man given to idle curiosity, though it would be some time yet before he admitted as much to himself. Morning came gray and reluctant, the strange haze thickening rather than burning off as the sun climbed. Nathaniel found Mrs. Hollis in the still room, counting bottles of last year's damson cordial against a ledger of her own, and put his question to her as plainly as he had resolved to the night before. The old gardener's cottage. "What do you know of it?" Mrs. Hollis did not look up from her counting immediately, which told him something in itself. "It was the gardener's cottage once, your grace, as its name says. Old Tobias lived there until his knees gave out, some 25 years back. And after Tobias? After Tobias, your grace, it stood empty, as it stands now." She set down her ledger with the particular firmness of a woman closing a drawer she did not wish opened again, save for a short while, when your mother let one of her people keep house there. A companion of hers. It was all before your time properly. You were no more than a boy. A companion. What was her name? Something crossed Mrs. Hollis's face then, not quite fear, but its careful cousin, the expression of a woman deciding how much of the truth a question deserved. "I don't recall it clearly, Your Grace. It was a great many years ago, and I was only under housekeeper then, with no cause to concern myself with your mother's private arrangements. You have run this house for 20 years, Mrs. Hollis. I have never once known your memory to fail you over so much as a missing teaspoon. Teaspoons are simpler matters, Your Grace." She picked the ledger back up, though her hands were not quite as steady over the counting as they had been a moment before. "Best let old dust lie where it settles, if Your Grace will permit the impertinence. There's little good comes of disturbing a house's quiet corners, and a great deal of grief can hide in them, waiting for a fool to go looking." "Is that a warning, Mrs. Hollis?" "It is an observation, Your Grace, from a woman who has swept a great many corners in her time." She did not meet his eye again before he left, and it was, Nathaniel thought as he crossed the yard toward the stables, a remarkably well-practiced sort of forgetting the kind that took years to perfect, and rather more reason than an old housekeeper's natural discretion. He found himself, over the following days, watching his household with a new and uncomfortable attentiveness. He noticed, as he had perhaps never troubled to notice before, how carefully the older servants avoided any mention of the years just after his father's death, how Cook's stories of the household's history always seemed to skip, with practiced smoothness, straight from his father's funeral to his mother's later illness, as though some years between the two had simply been misplaced. He noticed, too, how naturally Verity Marsh had settled into the rhythm of his days, how he had begun to time his own errands around the hour the hounds were walked, without quite admitting to himself that he was doing so. Verity, for her part, spent that same week much as she had spent every week since her arrival, feeding, walking, and brushing two hounds who required rather less looking after than the household's opinion of them suggested, and running such errands as Mrs. Hollis saw fit to add to her lightened duties. It was one such errand, carrying a basket of the estate's reduced flour ration to a laborer's cottage at the edge of Sedgefen, that brought her face to face with a hunger she recognized rather better than she wished it to. The cottage belonged to a family named Ackroyd, a thresher's widow, and her 4 children, the eldest no more than 11, and already doing a grown man's work in the fields for half a grown man's wage. The children watched Verity's basket with an attention so fixed, so carefully controlled, that she found herself thinking of her own childhood table, and the particular discipline it took a hungry child to wait for permission before reaching for bread that was, in fact, entirely theirs. "Thank you kindly, miss," the widow said, taking the basket with hands reddened and cracked from work that never quite stopped for weather or grief. "His Grace is generous this year, whatever Mr. Sharp says of what the estate can spare." "Does Mr. Sharp say it can spare little, then?" "Mr. Sharp says a great many things, miss, and has said them for longer than I've had children to feed. He'll tell you himself the granary's near empty, and perhaps it is. It was near empty the year my own mother went hungry, too, and the year before that, and I've learned not to ask a steward to account for arithmetic that never seems to add up the same way twice." It was said without particular rancor, the flat, tired observation of a woman, with no leisure left over for outrage, and yet it settled into Verity with an unease she could not immediately name, and did not fully understand until some days later, when far graver matters had given her ample cause to remember it. An old woman sat in the doorway of the neighboring cottage as Verity took her leave, a shawl the color of faded lavender, drawn close about her shoulders despite the July warmth, and watched Verity's approach with an attention rather sharper than her clouded eyes seemed to warrant. "You've a look of someone," the old woman said as Verity passed near enough to be addressed. "Can't place who. Something about the walk of you." She squinted harder, then shook her head, as though dislodging a thought too slippery to hold. "No matter. Old eyes see faces everywhere these days that were buried long before you were born. I shouldn't wonder." Verity smiled politely, murmured something about the summer's heat affecting everyone's eyes, and walked on, and did not think again of the old woman's words until considerably later, when they returned to her with a force she could not at the time have anticipated. She walked back to Farley Hall, turning the widow's words over, as one might turn a stone in a pocket, worn smooth by handling, without yet knowing what shape it would eventually reveal. It was on one such morning, 3 days after his conversation with Mrs. Hollis, that Ajax stole the glove. He did so, in Verity's private opinion, with a theatrical flourish entirely unnecessary to the crime itself. She had left the pair of them briefly in the stable yard while she fetched fresh water for their bowls, and returned to find Ajax trotting away with one of the Duke's riding gloves clamped triumphantly in his jaws, Hector following at a more dignified pace, as if to suggest he had had no part in the matter whatsoever. Ajax, Verity set down the water and gave chase, skirts gathered in one fist, temper rising rather faster than her stride. The hound showed no sign of slowing. He bounded across the lawn, through a side door left ajar by some careless footman, and down the corridor toward the library, tail high with the particular glee of a creature who understood perfectly well he was doing wrong and had decided to enjoy it regardless. By the time Verity reached the library door, breathless and thoroughly out of temper, Ajax had already deposited his prize at the feet of its rightful owner. Nathaniel looked up from the estate map spread across the long table, one eyebrow lifting at the state of his glove, now considerably damper than when he had last worn it. I begin to suspect he does this deliberately. I'm so sorry, Your Grace. He got past me before He has stolen this same glove 4 times this month. I have started to wonder whether he simply prefers the taste of good calfskin to any moral objection to theft. He turned it over in his hands, examining the fresh tooth marks, with the resigned air of a man cataloging an old injury. It has survived a hunt, 2 winters, and 1 exceptionally damp funeral. I begin to think it will outlive us both. Despite herself, Verity laughed a short, surprised sound she had not entirely intended to let out in front of a duke. Ajax, delighted with the reception his crime had received, promptly went to investigate the lower shelves, where something had apparently caught his interest enough to warrant a thorough sniffing. Hector, not to be outdone, joined him, and between the two of them managed to dislodge a stack of old ledgers that had clearly not been touched in some years, sending a small gray cloud of dust up into the afternoon light and setting Verity coughing. Forgive them, Your Grace. I'll set it right. She knelt to gather the fallen volumes, and it was in doing so, pushing aside a warped account book to reach one that had slid behind the lowest shelf, that her fingers brushed something tucked into the gap between the shelf and the wall. Not a book. Something thinner, wrapped in a ribbon gone brittle and gray with age. What is that? I don't know, Your Grace. She drew it out carefully, and the ribbon crumbled at the first gentle pull, dissolving into a scatter of gray threads across the library floor. Beneath it lay a single folded sheet of paper. The ink faded to the color of weak tea, though the hand upon it was still perfectly legible. Nathaniel came to kneel beside her, an act of such casual disregard for his own dignity that Verity did not know quite where to look, and together they unfolded it. My dear Susanna, it began, in a firm, elegant hand. Verity did not recognize, and Nathaniel did at once, and with a stillness that told her whose hand it was before he said a word. I do not know how to thank you properly for standing by me through the worst week this house has known, nor how Farley Hall would have borne it at all without your steadiness. You have my gratitude, and more than my gratitude, for as long as I live. C.D. The room seemed for a moment to lose its ordinary dimensions. Susanna, Verity said, and her own voice sounded strange to her, distant, as though it belonged to someone standing several rooms away. That was my mother's name. Nathaniel looked at her sharply. Your mother? Susanna Marsh. She died 5 years ago. Verity's fingers had gone very still around the paper, as though holding it too tightly might make the ink run and the words disappear before she had properly understood them. She never once told me she had been in this county. She never told me anything of before Lincolnshire at all. C.D. Nathaniel said the initials slowly, as a man testing a wound to see how deep it ran. Cecilia Deverill, my mother. He was quiet a moment, his eyes still on the letter rather than on Verity. I have seen her hand on 100 household accounts, and I do not believe I have ever once seen it write anything so plainly grateful. She was not, as a rule, a demonstrative woman. I remember her crying only once in my life, the day my father was buried, and never again after, not even at the end. Then, whatever happened that week must have been very great, Your Grace, to move her to write such a thing. Yes, he said. I begin to think it must have been. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Ajax, oblivious to the shift in the room's temper, had settled himself contentedly across Nathaniel's boots, the stolen glove entirely forgotten. "I want to know what this means," Verity said finally, and was faintly surprised at the steadiness of her own voice. "If your grace will permit it." "I want to know it a good deal more than you imagine," Nathaniel said, and there was something in his face, not quite alarm, not quite hope, but some unsettled cousin of both that told her he meant every word of it. They found the wage ledgers an hour later, in the estate's records room, a low, dust-smelling chamber behind the steward's office that Nathaniel visited so rarely he had to ask a footman where the key was kept. The volumes were arranged by year in a hand. Verity now recognized, having seen enough of Sharp's careful, sloping penmanship on the week's accounts to know it anywhere. They found the year easily enough. Nathaniel simply counted backward from his own birth and guessed, correctly, that whatever had happened before he was old enough to remember it clearly. The household wages for that year were listed as they always were: cook, housekeeper, footman, grooms, each name followed by a sum entered in Sharp's neat, unhurried hand. Near the bottom of the page, under a heading of its own, separate from the ordinary household staff, was a single entry: Susanna Marsh, companion to her grace. The sum beside it was nearly 3 times what any lady's maid in the house was paid, and considerably more than Nathaniel had ever thought to pay a companion of his own mother's, had he ever had cause to hire one. Beside the entry, in a smaller hand that looked as though it had been added some weeks after the rest, ran a single faint line: "Provision agreed. See steward's private account." "What does that mean, your grace?" "A provision? I don't know." Nathaniel turned the page forward, then back, searching for any further reference, but the ledger offered nothing more. There is no steward's private account among these books. If one ever existed, it has not survived, or was never kept here at all. She was not a servant, Verity said slowly, not an ordinary one. No, Nathaniel agreed. She was not. Mrs. Hollis, confronted a second time, this time with a name rather than a vague question, went the color of unbleached linen. "I told your grace there was little good in disturbing a house's quiet corners," she said, and her hands, usually so steady over her keys, would not quite keep still. The ring of them slipped from her fingers entirely and struck the flagstones with a sound that made all 3 of them start. She bent to retrieve them, and when she straightened, her composure had returned, though her voice had not fully recovered its usual briskness. "Susanna Marsh was a good woman, whatever anyone tells you otherwise. I'll say that much and no more, Miss Hollis." Nathaniel's voice was gentle, but it did not waver. "I am not asking you to speak ill of her. I am asking you to tell me what happened to her." "There was trouble, your grace. Bad trouble. The year your father had been gone scarce 2 12-months, and your mother was left to manage as best she could, with half the county's harvest failed, and men out of work and out of patience besides. Men came searching the grounds one night, and Mrs. Marsh was gone by morning, and her grace forbade anyone in this house from speaking her name again, on pain of dismissal." The housekeeper's mouth pressed into a thin, unhappy line, and for a moment, Verity thought she say more, her lips parted, as though some further sentence were pressing against her teeth, wanting out. Then she seemed to catch herself, and the door closed again, as surely as if she had shut it with her own 2 hands. "The assizes had a hand in it, if you must know more, and the assizes keep their own records, not mine. I've told you all I know, and more than I ought." She would say nothing further, and Nathaniel, watching the old woman's hands tremble around her ring of keys, did not press her again that day. That evening, alone in what had once been his mother's private sitting room, a chamber he entered perhaps twice a year, when the need for some forgotten document outweighed his reluctance to disturb it, Nathaniel searched her old writing desk with the particular carefulness of a man handling something he was not entirely certain he wished to find. Most of what the desk held was unremarkable: dried ink, a broken seal, correspondence concerning charitable subscriptions long since resolved. But in the desk's lowest drawer, beneath a false bottom, he discovered only by the accident of a stuck runner, lay a single sheet of paper torn across the middle, as though begun in anger and abandoned before it could be finished. "I have tried these 3 days to find the courage to write this properly, and find I cannot, though I know now that I must." The sentence ended there, the paper torn clean through the single letter that might have named whoever the rest had been intended for. Nathaniel sat with it a long while in the darkening room, turning it over as though the reverse side might yield what the tear had taken, and found, in the end, only his mother's hand, and his own ignorance of what had frightened her, enough to begin a letter she could not finish, and never, it seemed, tried again. He did not show it to Verity that night. It felt somehow too raw a thing to hand across so soon after the letter they had already found together, and he told himself he would wait until he better understood what he was placing in her hands. It was a decision he would later have cause to regret, though not for many weeks yet. It was Verity who first spoke the word aloud that neither of them had yet dared to use. "The assizes," she said later, in the quiet of the library, where they had returned as though drawn by some habit already forming between them. "Mrs. Hollis said assizes, your grace, not the poorhouse, not a dismissal. I know what she said. People are not brought before the assizes for leaving a position, however badly." Nathaniel said nothing for a long moment, because he had no comfort to offer that would not have been, in some fashion, a lie. Beyond the library window, a boy was crying the day's news up from the direction of the Fenbridge Road. Something about riots, about ricks burned and threshing machines broken in a county some 50 miles distant, where the harvest had failed as badly as it had failed at Sedgefen, and where, by all the boy's shouting could tell them, several men now sat in jail awaiting the judgment of the next assizes. It was not, Nathaniel reflected grimly, a summer in which any Englishman needed reminding what hunger could drive ordinary men to attempt, nor what the law was generally prepared to do about it afterward. "We will go to Fenbridge," he said. "The court there keeps its own records, whatever business Mrs. Hollis will not discuss. If your mother's name was written down anywhere beyond a ledger of wages, it will be written down there." Verity looked at him, this man who owned the house she had been scrubbing floors in a week before, who now proposed to ride to a county town on her behalf, over a mystery that was, by any ordinary reckoning, none of his concern, and did not know for once what to say to him at all. They did not leave for Fenbridge at once. Estate business intervened, as it generally did a dispute between two tenant farmers over a boundary hedge, a letter from the corn factor requiring an answer by return post, and the small, grinding business of keeping 40 servants fed and occupied in a summer when the larder grew thinner by the week. It was nearly a week before Nathaniel could arrange the journey, and in that waiting, something in the household's ordinary rhythm shifted, quietly, without either of them remarking on it directly. He took to walking the hounds himself in the evenings, when Verity's other duties kept her occupied until dusk, and found her there more often than not, waiting by the kennels with the leads already in hand, as though some private clock had begun to keep the two of them on the same hour without consulting either of their wishes. "You need not wait for me, your grace," she told him. One such evening, when the sky had gone the color of a healing bruise, and the day's haze had thinned enough to show a few uncertain stars. "I am aware." He took Ajax's lead from her regardless, his fingers brushing hers in the doing of it, briefly, with no more ceremony than the exchange of a lead generally required. "I find I prefer the company. That is not a very ducal thing to admit. I am told I am not a very ducal sort of duke on the whole." My mother despaired of it. Something eased in his face at the memory, the way grief sometimes does when a person finds, unexpectedly, that they can still laugh at what they have lost. "She would have liked you, I think. She had very little patience for people who curtsied more than they spoke their minds." "I curtsy a great deal, your grace. You have also told me, in the space of 1 week, that my hounds have poor manners, that propriety makes a house feel like a church, and that I am not to be trusted to walk in a straight line without supervision. I begin to think the curtsies are largely ornamental." Verity felt the smile come before she could arrange her face into anything more suitable, and did not try very hard to stop it. They walked on in a silence that had by now very little awkwardness left in it, the hounds ranging ahead in the dimming light, and Verity found herself wondering not for the first time, though with rather more alarm than the thought generally provoked, what precisely she imagined was happening between herself and a man who owned the ground she walked on, in every sense the word allowed. She did not let herself finish the thought. There was, she reminded herself firmly, a great deal of grief and mystery yet unresolved before either of them had any business considering what came after it. And a maid who forgot her position twice in 1 week was a maid asking for a harder lesson than the first had taught her. The following evening brought a different sort of conversation. Though the hounds ranged ahead in much the same manner, Hector pausing every few yards to investigate some smell of consuming importance that Ajax had already dismissed as beneath notice. "My mother taught me a good deal about animals," Verity said, apropos of nothing in particular, watching Ajax circle back to nose at her apron pocket out of what had by now become pure habit rather than any real search. She said a frightened creature could always tell the difference between a hand that meant it harm and a hand that did not, and that most people forgot to make the distinction plain in how they moved, so the animal was left to guess. She never explained why she knew it so certainly. I assumed as a girl that everyone's mother knew such things. "Mine kept a spaniel who bit everyone but her," Nathaniel offered. "I used to think it a fault in the dog. I begin to wonder now whether it was rather a fault in everyone else." "You are making a joke of it, Your Grace." "I am making a joke of it because the alternative is considering how very little I actually know about the woman who raised me, and I find I would rather laugh at a spaniel first." He glanced at her sideways, the dying light catching the gray of his eyes in a way Verity found she did not want to examine too closely. "May I ask you something, Verity?" It was the first time he had used her given name, and she felt it land somewhere just beneath her ribs, warm and entirely unwelcome in its warmth. "You may ask, Your Grace. I cannot promise a satisfactory answer. Are you afraid of him, Mr. Sharp?" The question landed harder than she had expected. She considered it honestly before answering, turning over the small unease she had carried since her first afternoon on the lawn, the look that had gone, once, to her apron pocket, and the questions asked in a voice too mild to be entirely without purpose. "I don't know that afraid is the right word, Your Grace. Careful, perhaps. He asks questions the way a man counts coin, as though he means to know the weight of an answer before he decides what it is worth." Nathaniel was quiet long enough that she thought perhaps she had overstepped after all. "I am afraid of what it says about me," he said finally, "that I have never once thought to ask the question you have just answered so plainly. I have let one man manage the whole of my family's fortune and my family's memory for 7 years because he was steady, and because being steady was more than I had any right to expect from anyone in the years just after my mother died. I do not know that I have ever properly examined whether steadiness and honesty are the same virtue, or whether they only ever happen to appear together by good fortune." "That is not an answer, Your Grace." "No," he agreed. "It is the beginning of one. I find I do not yet like where it ends." The journey to Fenbridge was delayed a second time, and rather more emphatically, by the arrival of Lady Constance Farrow. She came in a carriage a good deal finer than the state of English harvests that year strictly warranted, dressed in a shade of rose silk that made the summer's gray haze seem, for one afternoon at least, entirely someone else's misfortune. She had come, ostensibly, to consult Nathaniel about a charity subscription her mother was organizing for the parish poor a cause verity, watching from the kennel yard with Ajax leaning heavily against her skirts, found herself unable to begrudge, whatever her private feelings about the lady proposing it. Ajax growled low in his throat the moment the carriage door opened. Hector, beside him, offered no such warning, merely watching with the flat, assessing stare of a creature reserving judgment. Still terrorizing the county's marriageable daughters. "I see," Lady Constance said, pausing at the sight of them, with one gloved hand still resting on the carriage door. Her gaze moved past the hounds to Verity, lingering there with an interest considerably sharper than good manners generally permitted. "You must be the new girl, the one everyone has been discussing since the assembly at Marsham." "Verity Marsh, my lady, how very fortunate for his grace to have found someone so useful." The words were pleasant enough on their surface, and yet something in the way Lady Constance said them settled uneasily in Verity's chest. In much the same manner, Sharp's earlier questions had the sense of being weighed by someone with a private ledger of her own, into which Verity's answer had just been carefully entered. Nathaniel came down the steps to greet her with the composure his position demanded, though Verity thought and told herself immediately that she had no business thinking it, that his bow lacked something of the warmth he had shown 2 evenings before. walking hounds beneath an uncertain summer sky. Lady Constance, this is an unexpected pleasure. Is it unexpected? Her smile did not waver. I understood His Grace to keep a very open house this season, though I confess I had not expected to find quite so much of interest in the kennel yard. She took his offered arm, graceful as a woman entirely aware of her own reflection, and the two of them disappeared into the house for the better part of the afternoon, over tea and the business of charitable subscriptions, while Verity attended to her own duties and told herself she had no cause to think of it further. Nathaniel found the afternoon considerably less pleasant than his guests seemed to. Lady Constance was clever and handsome and possessed of exactly the sort of easy conversation that made most drawing rooms in the county eager for her company, and he spent the better part of 2 hours waiting for some private thought of his own to surface that was not in some fashion a comparison unfavorable to her. "You are distracted, Your Grace," she observed over the second pot of tea, with the particular sharpness of a woman who noticed everything and forgave rather less of it than she let on. "I begin to wonder whether the estate's troubles weigh on you more than you let the county believe. The harvest weighs on every landholder in England this year, Lady Constance. I doubt I am unique in that." "No," she agreed, watching him with an attention he found, increasingly, that he did not care for. "Though I wonder whether it is entirely the harvest that has your thoughts elsewhere." Her gaze held his a moment longer than the remark strictly required, and Nathaniel, declining to give her the satisfaction of an answer either way, turned the conversation firmly back toward the charitable subscription that had ostensibly brought her to his house at all. He did not think of the exchange again until considerably later that evening, and when he did, it was with the uncomfortable suspicion that Lady Constance had seen a good deal more than he had said aloud, and had filed it away, as she seemed to file most things, for some future use of her own choosing. She thought of it further regardless. Some hours later, when an errand with clean linen carried her past the open door of the small drawing room where Lady Constance had been persuaded to stay to dine. She had meant only to pass by. It was the sound of Mr. Sharp's voice, low and unhurried within, that slowed her step. "And I have told your father the arrangement stands as agreed, my lady, whatever the weather does to the northern fields." A man in his position cannot afford to be seen wavering, not this year of all years. "My father is not the one who wavers, Mr. Sharp. He merely worries, which is a different failing entirely, and a more expensive one." Lady Constance's laugh was light, practiced, the sort of sound meant to carry no further than the person it was intended for. "You will forgive me for saying I had not expected to find the estate's own steward quite so well acquainted with my family's private affairs." "A steward learns to be acquainted with a great many things, my lady, if he means to be of use to anyone." For one unsettling moment, Sharp's voice stopped short, and Verity went very still in the doorway's shadow, certain she had been heard. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted lighter, more general, the sort of remark any steward might make to any guest about the weather's effect on trade, and she understood, with a small cold clarity, that he had not seen her at all, only sensed some disturbance in the corridor's quiet, and adjusted his words accordingly, the way a man might straighten his coat on catching sight of his own reflection. Verity moved on before either of them noticed her in the doorway, the linen suddenly very heavy in her arms, and told herself, as she folded it away in the drawing room, with hands that were not quite steady, that stewards and quality families spoke of business matters constantly, and that there was nothing remarkable in a land agent knowing the affairs of a family his master's guests belonged to. She almost believed it. She was beginning, however, to notice how often lately she had needed to tell herself such things twice before the telling took. That same week, Mrs. Hollis found a quiet moment to draw Verity aside in the linen room, her expression carrying none of its usual brisk authority, but something softer and rather more troubled. "I'll not pretend I haven't noticed how His Grace has taken to walking those hounds himself of an evening," she said, folding a pillowcase with more attention than the task required. "Nor how often you're there to meet him when he does. I'm not accusing you of anything untoward, Miss Marsh, so you needn't color up so. I'm only telling you what 20 years in this house has taught me plainly enough. A duke may walk beside a maid in the evening light and mean nothing improper by it at all, and the maid may still be the only one of the two of them who pays for it, when the summer ends and the county remembers itself. I have given his grace no cause to think of me as anything but his hound's keeper, Mrs. Hollis. I don't doubt it. The housekeeper's hands stilled on the linen. It is rarely the maid's conduct that decides these things, in my experience. It is everyone else's imagination, and everyone else's tongue, and neither of those has ever once asked permission before doing its damage. She set the folded pillowcase atop its fellows, with a finality that closed the subject as firmly as any door. Guard your own heart, if no one else will trouble to guard it for you. That is all I'll say on it. It was, Verity thought later, rather more than Mrs. Hollis generally troubled to say about anything, and she found she could not entirely dismiss the warning, however much she wished to. That night, Verity lay awake, turning the housekeeper's words over in her mind, and found she could not decide which frightened her more, the possibility that Mrs. Hollis was right, or the growing certainty that she would not, even now, have chosen to guard her heart any more carefully than she already had, given the choosing over again. She thought of her mother, whose caution had been so thorough it had swallowed 20 years of her own history whole, and wondered, not for the first time, whether that same caution had cost Susanna Marsh more than it had ever protected her from. It was not, Verity decided, a comfortable thought to fall asleep on, and she did not fall asleep for some considerable time after having it. The visit to Fenbridge was set at last, for the following week. Once Lady Constance and her mother had departed, and the business of the charity subscription had been settled to everyone's apparent satisfaction, Nathaniel handed Verity up into the gig himself on the appointed morning, an act Mrs. Hollis observed from the scullery window, with an expression that suggested she had opinions she had no intention of sharing, and they set off along the Fenbridge road with Ajax and Hector, denied the journey, watching mournfully from the stable yard until the hedgerows hid them from view. The road ran flat and straight through country that seemed, that summer, to have forgotten how to be green in the ordinary way, the wheat stunted and pale where it stood at all, the dikes running high and brown from a season of rain that never quite turned to warmth. Windmills stood idle at the field edges, their sails unmoving in air too still to turn them, and here and there a laborer straightened from his work to watch the gig pass with the particular, wary attention of a man wondering whether its passengers meant him any trouble. Neither Nathaniel nor Verity spoke a great deal along the way, at first. There seemed between them no particular need to hurry toward whatever waited for them at the end of the road, and a great deal to lose, perhaps, in saying too much of what each privately hoped, or feared, they might find. It was Verity who broke the silence, first some miles outside Sedgefen, when the flat monotony of the road had worn away enough of her reserve to let the question out before caution could stop it. "What do you hope we find, Your Grace?" I had not let myself examine the question quite so directly. He kept his eyes on the road, on the horse's ears twitching against the flies. "I think, if I am honest, I hope to find that my mother was deceived by someone, and not that she deceived herself or worse, deceived others knowingly. It is a smaller kindness to a memory, perhaps, than it sounds. And if it is neither, Your Grace, if there is simply an unhappy truth and no one left to blame for it at all, then I shall have to learn to sit with that, as I imagine you have had a good deal more practice doing than I have." He glanced at her then, briefly. "You have never once asked what I hope to gain from any of this. Most people, in my experience, ask that rather early. I assumed Your Grace's reasons were his own business. They are rather more entangled with yours than either of us anticipated. A fortnight ago, Miss Marsh." He said it lightly, though something beneath the lightness did not feel light at all. I find I mind that a good deal less than I ought to. Verity did not trust herself to answer that as directly as it deserved, and instead watched the windmills pass, their idle sails black against the pale, hazy sky. Fenbridge announced itself first by smell tanning yards, and the market's fish stalls competing for supremacy, long before the town's gray church tower came into view above the flat fields, and then by sound, the ordinary bustle of a county town on market day, entirely indifferent to the private urgency of the two travelers picking their way through it. The court stood beside the church, a squat brick building that had clearly begun its life as something more modest and been extended, gracelessly, to suit the growing business of the county's law. A clerk at the outer desk directed them, after some consultation of a ledger even more disorganized than the one they had left behind at Farley Hall, to a narrow room at the back where the older sessions' records were kept, and to a man who might, if he were in a mood to be helpful, know where to find what they wanted. He was known, they would learn shortly, to nearly everyone who had business at the Fenbridge court, though rarely by his military rank the clerks called him simply Combe, and deferred to his memory for old records, rather more readily than to their own ledgers, since 12 years of soldiering had left him with considerably less patience for disorder than most men who had never worn a uniform. The man in question was seated at a high desk, surrounded by boxes of yellowing paper, working through a stack of documents before him with the plodding, workmanlike thoroughness of someone who had long ago stopped expecting his work to be interesting and had made his peace with it regardless. He rose when they entered, favoring his left leg slightly as he did so, and Nathaniel noted, without meaning to, the old scar that ran from temple to jaw on one side of an otherwise unremarkable face. Corporal Ezekiel Combe, your grace, court usher, at your service. Waterloo, and before that the Peninsula, if your grace is wondering about the leg. I've grown used to the wondering. I was not wondering, Mr. Combe, though I thank you for the courtesy of the account regardless. Most gentlemen wonder, your grace, whether they say so or not. Saves us both the trouble if I say it plain. Something in Combe's weathered face suggested a man who had decided, somewhere on a battlefield or in the long convalescence after it, that plain speaking was worth rather more than the ordinary courtesies it sometimes offended. Now, what is it brings a duke to my dusty little corner of the county's business? Nathaniel explained as much as seemed necessary a household mystery, a name that had come to light, a year some 20 years past. Combe listened without interrupting, his expression settling, by degrees, into something graver than mere professional attention. Elias Marsh, he said when Nathaniel finished. He did not consult any ledger to say it. You'll forgive me knowing the name without looking it up, your grace. There's names a man doesn't forget, whatever else the years take from him. Verity's heart had gone very still. You knew him, sir? I was 13 years old, that spring, miss, and my father kept the smithy on the Fenbridge Road. I stood in the market square the day they hanged him, along with half the town, because that's what a boy did in those days when there was a hanging to see, and thought nothing much of it beforehand beyond the excitement any boy feels at something he's told is important. Comb's jaw worked once before he continued. I've thought a good deal more of it since. What do you mean, sir? Nathaniel asked. I mean, your grace, that I was 13 and fool enough to believe whatever a magistrate told a crowd from a scaffold, and old enough now to have turned that day over in my mind more times than I can rightly count, and found less of it holds together the longer I look at it. Combe moved to one of the boxes, running a scarsded finger along a row of spines with the ease of long familiarity. Elias Marsh worked the mill at Sedgefen, steady man, by all anyone said of him at the time not a rioter's temperament, not the sort you'd expect to see leading a mob to burn a rick, but there'd been trouble that spring, same as there's trouble now, and someone needed hanging for the county's peace of mind, and Marsh had made himself unpopular with the wrong sort of people not long before, by all accounts. Unpopular how, sir? That, miss, I couldn't tell you with certainty. I was 13, and my father kept me well clear of grown men's business, as fathers did. There was talk after, that he'd gone about saying the grain wasn't short at all, that there was corn enough in certain granaries to feed the parish twice over, if certain men weren't holding it back for a better price once the panic drove the market up. Talk like that doesn't sit well with the men doing the holding, whoever they might have been. He drew a slim, leather-bound volume from the box and set it on the desk between them, opening it with the careful, deliberate movement of a man who had handled a great many painful documents and learned not to let his hands hurry past the ones that mattered. Elias Marsh, miller's man of Sedgefen, the entry read, in a clerk's formal hand, quite unlike Sharp's, tried before the spring assizes on charge of riotous assembly and incitement to unlawful combination, convicted upon the testimony of 3 witnesses, sentence of death carried out at Fenbridge, the 23rd of March. The date beneath it read 1796. Verity read it twice before the numbers arranged themselves into any sense at all. She had been born in the winter of that same year by her own reckoning, a reckoning built on nothing sturdier than her mother's word, given once, reluctantly, when Verity was old enough to ask her own age and old enough just to notice how carefully her mother avoided the month and the place both. "The witnesses," she said, and was faintly surprised her voice worked at all. "Are they named, sir?" Combe turned the page. 3 names stood beneath the verdict, in the same clerk's hand. Verity did not recognize any of them. It was the 4th line beneath the names that stopped her breath entirely a note, added later, in different ink, in a hand she now knew rather better than she wished to. "Expenses of the prosecution defrayed by O. Sharp-esque, land steward to Her Grace the Duchess of Hallowdene, in the sum of £11. Nathaniel read the note twice as she had read the date, and when he looked up, his face had lost whatever composure the morning's ride had left him. "That is my steward's name," he said quietly, "on a document paying to prosecute a man for telling the truth about a granary." "We don't know it was the truth, Your Grace," Combe said, though his tone suggested he believed otherwise. "We know a man died on the strength of 3 witnesses, and a great deal of fear. In a year fear was cheap and truth was dear, same as it's threatening to be again this summer if the harvest doesn't turn." He closed the volume gently, as though the paper itself deserved some small mercy after what it had recorded. "I'll say this much, for what an old soldier's opinion is worth. I've seen men hang who deserved rather worse than hanging, and I've seen the reverse, and that day in the market square never once sat easy with me. Not from the moment the trap fell to this one, 20 years on." Verity found she could not for the moment produce any words at all. She stood very still in the small, dust-choked room, holding a fact she had not known she was searching for until it had been placed directly in her hands, a father, a name, a date that fit her own birth, like a key turning in a lock she had not known existed. Elias Marsh. Her father, hanged in this very town, on the word of a steward who had, until a fortnight ago, asked her mild questions about her family over a garden lawn. Miss Comb's voice was gentler than she would have credited a man of his weathered face capable of, and she realized, distantly, that her legs had gone rather less steady than she would have wished them to be. "Sit yourself down a moment. There's no shame in it. I've seen grown men buckle at a good deal less than what you've just read." She sat, because her body seemed to have decided the matter without consulting her, and Nathaniel knelt beside the chair, with a hand hovering near her shoulder, not quite touching, as though uncertain whether comfort was his to offer just then. "Verity." He said her name the way he had said it once before, on an evening walk that felt, now, impossibly distant. "I am so sorry." "You have nothing to be sorry for, Your Grace." Her voice came out steadier than she felt, from some reserve of her mother's own discipline she had not known she possessed until she needed it. "You did not hang him. You were a child yourself. My steward paid for the rope." The bluntness of it, said aloud in that dusty little room, seemed to settle something final and heavy over all 3 of them, and none of them found anything further to say for a long while after. It was Combe who broke the silence at last, in the practical manner of a man who had learned, in his own convalescence, that grief needed a task to lean on before it could bear its own weight. "If it's of any comfort, Your Grace, Miss Marsh, I kept my own private notes of that spring. Being a boy who found the whole business troubled his sleep for months after. Nothing so grand as evidence a court would credit, you understand. But names, dates, the things a frightened town says to itself when it thinks no one important is listening. If you've a mind to know more of what happened to your mother after, I may be able to point you toward men still living who remember it better than a court record ever troubles to. I would be grateful for that, Mr. Combe. More grateful than I know how to say properly. No need to say it prettily, miss. Say it plainly, same as I do, and we'll get along fine." Something that might, in a less careworn face, have been the beginning of a smile crossed his features. "I'll send word to Farley Hall directly, if anything comes of my asking about." They left Fenbridge in the late afternoon, the market crowds thinning as the day's business wound down, and rode back along the flat road in a silence considerably heavier than the one that had carried them there that morning. Verity held the small copy Combe had made for her of the ledger's entry, his own careful hand, offered without her asking, so that she need not carry the original document away from the court's keeping, and did not speak until the spire of Fenbridge's church had long since sunk below the horizon behind them. Grief, Verity discovered in the days that followed, was not a single thing to be borne once and set aside, but a series of small ambushes, arriving at moments too ordinary to have prepared for them. It came upon her scrubbing the kennel floor, thinking of nothing in particular, and finding herself suddenly and completely undone by the plain fact that she had a father's name now, and no memory whatsoever to attach to it, no voice, no face, nothing but a date and a rope and a steward's careful accounting of £11. It came upon her feeding the hounds, watching Ajax take bread from her hand with the same unthinking trust he had shown her from the first morning, and wondering, with a bitterness that startled her, whether that trust would have been offered so easily to a man the county had chosen to hang. She grew quieter that week, and Nathaniel, watching the change in her with an attentiveness that had become by now second nature to him, did not know how to close the distance that had opened between them, nor whether it was his place to try. "You need not walk with me, if the company troubles you," he told her, one evening when 3 days of monosyllables had made the silence between them considerably less companionable than it had once been. "It is not your company that troubles me, your grace." She said it honestly, because there seemed little use in anything else between them now. "It is the fact of your house, your steward's ledgers, your family's name, written above the money that paid for the evidence against my father, whatever the truth of that evidence was." She heard the unfairness in it even as she said it, and could not for the moment find the will to soften it. "I do not know how to walk beside Farley Hall's duke, and forget, even for the length of an evening, that Farley Hall's steward hanged my father." "I did not know it, Verity, I believe you." And she did, without reservation. It was perhaps the one certainty she still possessed, amid everything else that had come loose that week. "That does not make it easier to stand in your library, your grace, and not wonder what else this house has quietly paid for, and quietly forgotten." Nathaniel absorbed that in silence, and did not try to argue her out of a grief that was by any measure wholly her right to feel exactly as sharply and as unfairly as it came to her. "Then I will earn back whatever ease you once found in my company," he said finally, "or I will not, and either way I will not blame you for the trying or the failing of it. But I intend to find out precisely what my steward did, Verity, and precisely why, and I would rather do it with you beside me than without, if you can bear my company that long." She did not answer him directly that evening, though she did not send him away either, and the two of them walked the remainder of the path in a silence that had grown, if not comfortable again, at least honest. She wrote nothing of it in any letter, having no one left to write to, and found instead that the grief settled most heavily in the ordinary silences of her day the hour before sleep, when there was no task left to occupy her hands, and nothing to do but turn the little copied ledger entry over and over, as though enough handling might soften what it said. She thought, more than once that week, of the man who had helped her carry it, Corporal Combe, with his scarred face and his plain, no-nonsense kindness, who had stood in a market square as a boy of 13, and never once, in 20 years, managed to make his peace with what he had watched happen there. She wondered whether grief simply worked that way in everyone arriving once, in full, and then returning forever, after in smaller, sharper pieces, at moments a person could never quite predict or prepare for. Miss Hollis noticed the change in her, too, though she said nothing of it, directly beyond a slightly gentler hand on Verity's shoulder one evening, and an extra portion of bread left, without comment, beside her plate at supper, the wordless charity of a woman who had clearly decided, at some point in the preceding fortnight, that whatever trouble had come looking for the new maid deserved rather more sympathy than the household's usual gossip had initially offered it. It was not sympathy Verity wanted, precisely. It was an answer to the question that had begun, by the week's end, to eclipse even her grief for a father she had never known, why a steady, careful steward, a man Nathaniel had trusted for 7 years, a man who counted coin and asked mild questions and smiled at everything, had once paid £11 to see a miller's man hanged for saying, quite possibly, nothing more dangerous than the truth. She raised the matter with Nathaniel directly. Some days later, over the estate's ordinary business of a morning. Have you spoken to Mr. Sharp of any of this, your grace? Not yet. I find I want more certainty before I put a question to him that he has had 20 years to prepare an answer for. Nathaniel's expression was troubled in a way she recognized now, the look of a man weighing loyalty against evidence and finding the scales considerably less balanced than he had believed a fortnight before. When my family's solicitor is coming to Farley Hall within the week regarding an unrelated matter of tenancy renewals. I intend to ask him quietly whether he recalls anything of that year or of any private accounts that might explain the notation we found in the wage ledger. It seemed to me the more prudent course, rather than confronting a man who has managed my family's fortune for 2 decades on the strength of a single old document. Prudent. Verity turned the word over and found she had rather less patience for it than she once might have. Your grace, my father waited on prudence and process too, and it hanged him. I know it. He met her eyes steadily, though what she saw there was closer to helplessness than she had ever seen him show before. I am asking you to trust a slower course than either of us would prefer, because a duke accusing his own steward on the strength of one ledger entry, without more certain ground beneath him, risks losing whatever evidence remains before we have properly gathered it. I do not ask you to be patient because I think your grief undeserving of haste. I ask it because I fear moving too soon will cost us the very proof we need. It was, Verity told herself later, a reasonable answer, offered by a reasonable man, in circumstances that called rather more for reason than for the hot, restless anger that had begun by then to crowd out most of her better judgment. She told herself that, and found, within a few more days of watching Sharp move through the house with his same mild, unhurried smile, that reason had stopped being sufficient company for her grief entirely. It happened on a night when the house had settled into its ordinary quiet, some 10 days after the visit to Fenbridge, and Sharp himself had ridden out to the Marsham Corn Exchange on business that was expected to keep him from Farley Hall until the following noon. Verity told herself, climbing the back stairs toward the steward's office with a single candle shielded carefully against the draught, that she meant only to look to see whether some record of the £11, some trace of the steward's private accounts that the wage ledger had gestured toward and never named, might be found in the ordinary course of his papers, without the necessity of confronting him directly or waiting on Mr. Wren's uncertain memory. It was, she would understand later, precisely the sort of reasoning grief was best at supplying, and precisely the sort that good sense would have recognized, in a calmer hour, as no reasoning at all. The office door was not locked. Sharp, it seemed, had never considered it necessary to guard against a household that trusted him as completely as this one did, and Verity slipped inside with a caution that felt, even to her, rather more like theft than investigation. The desk yielded nothing of obvious use correspondence concerning the corn factor, tenancy agreements, the estate's ordinary business laid out in Sharp's familiar, unhurried hand. It was the locked drawer beneath the desk's writing surface that drew her attention, its keyhole small and old-fashioned enough that a hairpin, carefully worked, might reasonably be expected to manage it. Given enough patience and rather more luck than Verity, in the moment, stopped to consider she might not possess. She was still working at the lock, candle guttering low against the draught from the window, when the door opened behind her, and Sharp's voice, mild as ever, filled the small room like cold water, finding every low place in a floor. Miss Marsh, I confess I had not expected to find you at my desk at this hour. Verity's heart seemed to stop entirely before resuming at twice its ordinary pace. She had not heard the horse return. She had not heard the door. She had heard nothing at all beyond the small, private scrape of metal against an old lock, and now stood with the hairpin still in her hand, and no honest explanation remotely equal to the circumstances. Mr. Sharp, there is no need to trouble yourself for an explanation just this moment. His voice remained perfectly even, perfectly pleasant, and it was that very evenness, more than any anger might have done, that told her how thoroughly she had misjudged the danger of the hour. I think it best we discuss this in the morning, with his grace present, and perhaps Mrs. Hollis as well. A maid found attempting a steward's locked drawer in the middle of the night is not, I think, a matter either of us should wish to settle quietly between ourselves. He said it kindly enough, on its surface, and Verity understood with a sick, sinking clarity that kindness was precisely the weapon he intended it to be, that whatever she said now, in her own defense, would sound exactly as guilty as the act itself, and that Sharp had positioned himself, in one mild sentence, as the injured party rather than the man whose past she had been trying to uncover. The morning brought precisely the reckoning Sharp had promised, conducted in Nathaniel's study with a formality that made Verity feel, for the first time since her arrival at Farley Hall, wholly and helplessly a servant again, rather than a woman who had walked these grounds beside its master as something closer to an equal. I found Miss Marsh attempting to force the lock on my private drawer. "Your Grace," Sharp said, standing with his hands folded before him, his tone carrying exactly the right measure of regret and none whatsoever of triumph, though Verity, watching him, could not shake the sense that some quiet satisfaction moved beneath the regret regardless. "I do not say this to see her dismissed without cause, Your Grace, only to note that a servant, who has taken to searching a steward's private papers, whatever her personal grievance, is a servant whose judgment the household can no longer safely rely upon. I was not stealing, Your Grace." Verity kept her voice steady with an effort that cost her far more than she let show. "I was looking for proof of what we found at Fenbridge, proof of the £11, proof of whatever this house has been hiding about my father for 20 years. An admirable motive, Miss Marsh, if it were conducted through admirable means." Sharp's tone remained, infuriatingly, mild and reasonable. I have told His Grace already that I have no memory of any payment concerning a man named Marsh, nor any private account beyond the estate's ordinary books, which he is welcome to examine at his leisure, in the proper hours, through the proper channels. What I cannot permit, for the good order of this household, is a maid taking it upon herself to force locks in the dead of night on the strength of her own private theories. Nathaniel had said little through the whole exchange, his face carrying an expression Verity could not fully read, not disbelief, precisely, but something closer to a man watching two versions of a story he wanted desperately to reconcile, and finding he could not yet manage it. Verity. He said her name carefully, mindful, she understood, of Sharp's presence and the household's watching eyes. "I believe you. I want you to know that plainly, before anything else is said this morning. But I cannot simply dismiss what has occurred, nor pretend that a servant searching a locked drawer without leave is a matter I can wave aside entirely, whatever the provocation. It would set a precedent I have no right to set, and it would give Mr. Sharp and anyone else who might wish to doubt either of us grounds to say, 'I favor you beyond what the evidence yet supports.'" "Then what would you have me do, Your Grace?" "I would have you step back from the Hound's care, for the time being, and from the library, and from anything that might be construed as undue closeness to my own private business, until Wren has come, and I have had proper time to examine the estate's accounts myself, through chancels no one can later call improper." He did not look pleased to be saying it. His jaw was tight, his eyes carrying an apology he could not in the moment afford to voice more plainly. "I am sorry for it. I do not think it just. I think it necessary, and I have learned this past fortnight that those two things are not always the same." Verity curtsied because there was nothing else left for her to do, and left the study with a composure that cost her every scrap of discipline her mother had ever taught her, and did not allow herself to weep until she had reached the privacy of her own narrow room beneath the eaves. She had wanted badly to be believed. She had not considered, until this precise morning, that being believed and being protected were not, in a house such as this, the same mercy at all. Combe was as good as his earlier promise. A letter arrived for her within the week, addressed in a plain, careful hand and containing, folded inside, a short account of his own boyhood recollections, names of families who had lived near the mill in 1796, an old neighbor still living who might remember more, and a closing line that did more for Verity's spirits than its brevity perhaps intended. "You did nothing wrong in asking questions, Miss. However, it looks to those who'd rather you hadn't. A soldier learns that much, if nothing else worth learning." She kept the letter tucked inside her mother's linen sachet, where it seemed, somehow, to belong beside the lavender and rosemary that had started the whole strange business of that summer, and found herself, in the quieter hours of her suspension, considerably less alone than the household's stricter arrangements might otherwise have made her feel. Bartholomew Wren arrived 3 days later, precisely on schedule, an elderly solicitor of dry manner and drier wit, who had managed the Devereux family's legal affairs for the better part of 4 decades, and possessed, as a consequence, a memory considerably longer than most of the household currently employed at Farley Hall. Nathaniel raised the matter with him carefully, over the tenancy renewals that had ostensibly brought him, working the true purpose of his questions in only once the more ordinary business had been settled. "Do you recall, Wren, whether my mother ever kept a private account separate from the estate's ordinary books? Something Sharp might have managed on her behalf in the years just after my father died?" Wren considered the question with the particular slowness of a man who had learned, across a long career, that hasty answers to careful questions generally cost more than they saved. "There was such an account, Your Grace, though I confess I have not thought of it in the better part of 20 years. Your mother established it shortly after your father's death, for the discreet management of certain personal charities and obligations she did not wish entered in the estate's ordinary books, where any curious eye might examine them. Sharp administered it entirely at her instruction. I drew up the original arrangement myself, though I was never shown its contents thereafter, nor asked to be. Would any record of it survive? I could not say with certainty, Your Grace. Such accounts are, by their nature, discreet, and this one was closed. Some years ago, I believe, shortly before your mother's death, though I was not consulted on the closing, only informed of it after the fact, in the ordinary course of settling her final affairs." Wren's pale eyes sharpened slightly. "May I ask what has prompted the question, Your Grace? You have the look of a man who has found something he did not expect to find." Nathaniel told him not everything, but enough. The letter, the ledger entry, the notation of a provision agreed, the £11 paid toward a prosecution 20 years gone. Wren listened with the stillness of a man absorbing a great deal more than his expression allowed him to show. "I will make what inquiries I can, Your Grace, discreetly, among the old banking houses in Fenbridge and Norwich. Such accounts leave traces, whatever the discretion intended for them, if one knows where to look and is patient enough to look properly." He was as good as his word. It was Wren, 3 days later, who brought Nathaniel the second piece of the puzzle, not from the closed account itself, which had left frustratingly little trace, but from an altogether different quarter. "I make it my business, Your Grace, to keep some acquaintance with the county's private finances, insofar as they touch upon families my clients have dealings with," Wren said, laying a small sheaf of papers on the desk between them with the careful precision of a man presenting evidence he did not enjoy having found. "It has come to my attention in the course of my other inquiries that your steward holds far more personal capital than his salary would readily explain sums invested, over a period of some years, in various concerns, including, most recently, a considerable joint venture in grain speculation, undertaking this very season with the Earl of Farrow." Nathaniel went very still. "Constance Farrow's father." "The same, Your Grace. The Farrow estate, I am given to understand, finds itself in considerable difficulty this year, bad management compounding a bad harvest, as is so often the case, and your Mr. Sharp appears to have offered his lordship conveniently timed assistance in exchange for a share in whatever profit the venture returns, should grain prices continue to rise as sharply as this summer's weather threatens to make them." Wren's mouth thinned. "It is not, strictly speaking, unlawful for a steward to hold private investments, Your Grace, however unwise a family might consider it. But a man who has spent 20 years quietly enriching himself from arrangements he took some evident trouble to keep private is not, I think, a man whose account of an old ledger notation you ought to accept without a good deal more scrutiny than you have so far applied." Rez left him with the papers and a final piece of dry, unwelcome advice that a man who discovers he has been deceived for 20 years does himself no favors by feeling foolish about it, since foolishness implies a carelessness Nathaniel had not, in fact, shown. He had simply trusted a man whose entire profession depended on being trusted completely, and had been better deceived than most gentlemen of his acquaintance generally managed to avoid. It was, Nathaniel supposed, meant as comfort. It did not fully succeed, though he appreciated the attempt more than he let show. Nathaniel sat with the papers a long while after Wren had taken his leave, turning over what the solicitor's careful, methodical inquiry had handed him, a steward with private wealth beyond easy explanation, a family in financial distress bound to that steward by a grain venture undertaken in secrecy into summer of failed harvests, and a young lady of that same family who had, only weeks before, watched Sharp with a familiarity that Verity had noticed, and Nathaniel, to his own lasting regret, had been too slow to examine properly himself. He understood, sitting there with the evidence spread before him, precisely why Sharp had wanted Verity discredited before she could gather more proof of the old ledger's meaning. A maid searching old assize records was a nuisance easily dismissed as grief and imagination. A maid whose search threatened to expose 20 years of quiet embezzlement, at the very moment a fresh and far larger fraud depended on the county's continued trust in Sharp's steady hand, was a threat of a different order altogether. And Lady Constance, whose family's fortunes now depended, in some part, on Sharp's continued freedom to manage both his old secrets and his new venture undisturbed, had every reason of her own to see Verity's credibility broken before the harvest supper, now only a fortnight distant, brought the whole county under Farley Hall's roof at once. Nathaniel rode out that same evening to find Verity in the kennel yard, where she had taken, since her suspension from the house's more private rooms, to spending what free hours she had left among Ajax and Hector, regardless of what the morning's ruling had technically permitted. "I believe I understand now why Sharp wanted you discredited," he told her, without preamble, because there seemed no gentler way to begin it, and because she had earned, he thought, far better than gentleness dressed up as delay. He told her what Wren had found: the private capital, the grain venture, the Farrow family's desperate dependence on Sharp's continued good fortune, and watched her face move through disbelief, and then something colder and more settled, as the shape of the whole conspiracy assembled itself before her. "Then he has been robbing this estate for 20 years, she said slowly, "and is robbing it still, and my father died so that the first theft would never be questioned. I believe so. I cannot yet prove the full shape of it, but I believe it completely." Nathaniel's voice carried none of the caution it had held 3 days before, in his study, weighing precedent against provocation. Whatever remained of his patience for prudence had burned away somewhere between Wren's papers and this moment. "I mean to see it proven properly, Verity, and I mean to see it proven soon. But I would ask one thing of you, difficult as I know it will be to grant." "What is that, your grace?" "A fortnight's patience. The harvest supper is nearly upon us, and I would rather move against Sharp with evidence too complete to be argued away, than move too soon and watch him slip free of it. On some technicality Wren has not yet had time to close. I know what patience has already cost you. I am asking for it regardless, because I do not trust myself to protect you properly if I move before I am certain." Verity looked at him a long moment, Ajax leaning warm and solid against her skirts, and found, to her own surprise, that some of the coldness in her chest had eased simply at being told, plainly, that he believed her that the distance of the past 3 days had not, after all, meant what she had feared it meant. "A fortnight, then," she said, "though I hope, your grace, that you have better luck at patience than I have managed so far this summer." "I hope so too," he said, and did not sound wholly certain of it himself. Neither of them yet knew how little that fortnight of patience would matter, once Sharp and Lady Constance moved first. The harvest supper that year was less a celebration than a ritual performed out of stubbornness, a formal acknowledgement, dressed in its usual finery, of a harvest that scarcely existed to be celebrated at all. Nathaniel had considered more than once in the preceding fortnight whether to cancel it altogether, and had decided against it, only because the tenants themselves had asked that it go forward, in the manner of people who understood that abandoning even a hollow tradition, in a year already stripped of so much else, cost more than it saved. The long barn had been swept and hung with what greenery the season allowed, tables set with the estate's best plate beside its thinnest bread, and by early evening the whole of Sedgefin's tenant families had gathered alongside the handful of gentry. Nathaniel had felt obliged to invite Lady Constance and her father among them, arrived that afternoon with a good deal more baggage than a single evening's visit generally required, though Nathaniel, distracted by a dozen other concerns, had thought little of it at the time. Verity attended in her ordinary capacity, carrying dishes and clearing plates alongside the rest of the household staff, her suspension from the Hounds' care and the house's more private rooms still technically in effect, though Nathaniel had found small, quiet ways to soften its edges wherever he safely could. Ajax and Hector remained shut in their kennel, for the evening Nathaniel having judged wrongly, as it would transpire that two enormous hounds among so large and unfamiliar a gathering posed greater risk than reward. Nathaniel had spent a good part of the early evening watching Verity move between the long tables, with a distraction he made no great effort to hide from anyone paying close attention, and had resolved, somewhere between the first course and the second, that he would find a private moment before the night ended to say plainly what he had spent the whole uncertain summer failing to say at all. He had not yet decided precisely how. He had decided more firmly that he no longer wished to wait for perfect timing, having learned, across one strange and difficult season, how little perfect timing generally troubled itself to arrive. He did not get the chance he had planned for. The trouble began, as these things generally did that summer, with Lady Constance rising to speak. She rose midway through the second course, once the wine had done its usual work of loosening the room's collective tongue, and addressed Nathaniel directly across the long table, her voice pitched to carry to every corner of the barn with the particular skill of a woman who had spent a great many drawing rooms learning exactly how to be overheard. Your Grace, forgive me for raising an unhappy matter at so festive an occasion. I would not do so if I did not believe the whole parish had a right to know it, given how closely it touches the safety of this house. Lady Constance. Nathaniel's voice carried a warning she chose, visibly, to ignore. I have learned, from sources I trust entirely, that the young woman currently serving this table her gaze found Verity, standing near the barn's far wall with a serving dish, still in her hands, is the daughter of a man hanged 20 years ago for inciting riot against this very estate. That her mother fled this county under circumstances your own household has kept carefully hidden ever since, and that this same young woman was discovered, not a fortnight past, attempting to force the lock on your steward's private papers in the dead of night. A murmur moved through the barn like wind through standing corn. Somewhere near the back, a tenant's chair scraped against the floor. Sharp rose then, with the reluctant, sorrowful air of a man performing an unpleasant civic duty rather than a calculated ambush. I did not wish this raised publicly, Your Grace, and I regret that Lady Constance has seen fit to do so. But since the matter is now before the room, I must in honesty confirm what I told you privately a fortnight ago. I found Miss Marsh attempting the lock myself. I have papers, if any here doubt it. He produced a small sheaf from his coat, its pages catching lamplight, as he held them aloft, showing irregularities of the same nature in her mother's own conduct, 20 years past. A pattern, Your Grace, however unhappy it is to say so, of a young woman I have found otherwise agreeable. Those papers prove nothing but a name and a suspicion, sharp, and you know it. Nathaniel's voice had gone hard in a manner few at that table had ever heard from him. I have reason to believe rather different papers exist ones concerning your own private dealings, not Miss Marsh's family, and I intend to have them examined properly, before this parish or anyone else, very soon. It was, he understood even as he said it, not enough. He had Wren's findings on Sharp's private wealth, and Wren's suspicion of the Pharaoh venture, but nothing yet in a form he could set before a barn full of tenants and gentry as conclusive proof, on an evening he had not chosen and could not control. Sharp's accusation, however unjust, had the advantage of being concrete: a name, a date, a locked drawer, a hand caught upon it. Nathaniel's defense had only the shape of a truth not yet fully assembled, and a room primed by hunger and fear to believe the worst of anyone new among them was not a room inclined to wait patiently for evidence still being gathered. Your Grace's confidence in Miss Marsh does him credit, Lady Constance said, with a gentleness that made the barb beneath it land all the harder. But I wonder whether the parish ought to have some say in whether a man hanged for treason against this estate should have his daughter now standing so very close to its master's private affairs. It is not, I think, an unreasonable question to ask, whatever affection has grown up around the asking of it. The word affection did its work precisely as intended. Verity felt the barn's collective attention shift all at once, from suspicion to something worse, a knowing, speculative curiosity, the particular cruelty of a crowd that believed it had just been handed the true shape of a scandal, romance and treachery both, wrapped together in one convenient parcel. She set down the serving dish, because her hands had begun to shake too badly to trust it otherwise, and found in that moment that she could not bear to stand in that barn one moment longer and be discussed as though she were not present to hear it. "If your grace will excuse me," she said, to no one in particular, and left before anyone could tell her whether she was excused or not. The storm broke within the hour, as though the summer's long, dry unease had simply been waiting for an excuse to discharge itself all at once. Verity packed what little she owned by the light of a single candle, her hands steadier now than they had been in the barn, moving with the flat, hollow efficiency of a woman who had decided, somewhere between the long table and her own narrow room, that leaving was the only dignity still available to her. Mrs. Hollis found her at the door, keys jangling uselessly at her waist, her face carrying an expression too complicated for Verity to untangle in the little time either of them had. "You needn't go, child." "I think I must, Mrs. Hollis. I have brought nothing to this house but old grief and new scandal, and his grace cannot fight a war on my behalf that half the parish now believes he is fighting for rather less honorable reasons than the truth." Verity's voice held steady, though the effort of it cost her nearly everything she had left. "Better I go quietly than stay and watch. It cost him everything Wren has been so carefully trying to preserve. His grace will not thank you for deciding that on his behalf. He will thank me rather less for staying, if staying ruins him." Verity managed something that was not quite a smile. "Tell him I am sorry if he asks. Tell him I do not regret any of it, whatever it looks like tonight." She went out into the rain before Mrs. Hollis could argue further, and did not look back at the kennels, where Ajax and Hector, shut in against the evening's crowd, had begun to bark and scratch at the door with a violence the household would later remember as considerably more than their usual evening restlessness, a violence no one, in the chaos of the storm and the barn's dispersing scandal, thought to heed until it was very much too late to matter. Below stairs, the household had gathered in the kind of anxious, whispering knot that generally followed any disaster grand enough to threaten the whole house's standing rather than merely one servant's. Cook, who had called Verity mutton thief bait scarcely 3 months before, found herself, to her own evident surprise, defending the girl rather more fiercely than she defended most things. "Whatever she did or didn't do with an old lock," Cook said, to no one in particular and everyone at once, "a girl doesn't deserve to be run out of a house in a storm like this, for the crime of having a father the county saw fit to hang 20 years before she was old enough to have any say in the matter." No one in the kitchen disagreed with her, though none of them, in the moment, knew quite what to do about it beyond murmured agreement, and an extra log added to the kitchen fire, against the vague hope that Miss Marsh might yet be persuaded to return to its warmth before the night was through. She walked without any clear destination. Beyond a way, the Fenbridge road swallowed almost immediately by darkness and rain, her cloak soaked through within the first quarter-mile, and her resolve considerably less steady than her feet. She thought, as she walked, of her mother making this same desperate calculation 20 years before, cloak soaked, an infant to protect, no one left in the world to vouch for either of them beyond her own exhausted resolve. It was, Verity realized somewhere in that first mile, the first time she had ever properly understood her mother's caution not as some inexplicable coldness handed down without reason, but as the ordinary, hard-won wisdom of a woman who had learned, at considerable cost, exactly how little the world's good opinion could be trusted to survive a single evening's gossip. She did not know, walking that road in her mother's own old footsteps, though she could not have known it, whether she was fleeing the same danger or simply its faint 20-year echo. She knew only that walking felt, for the moment, like the one thing still entirely within her own choosing. It was perhaps 2 miles along that road, at a crossroads where a solitary lantern still burned outside a small posting inn that she nearly walked directly into Corporal Ezekiel Combe, who had ridden out from Fenbridge that same evening on an errand of his own, and who recognized her, even soaked and half-blind with rain, before she recognized him. Miss Marsh. In this weather, and alone, he swung down from his horse with the quick, economical movement of a man, used to managing an awkward leg in worse conditions than a summer storm. Whatever's happened, it can't have happened well for you to be out on a night like this, she told him, in pieces, between one gust of wind and the next, and watched his weathered face darken with an anger that surprised her, coming from a man she had known scarcely a fortnight. Constance Farrow and that steward of yours. He said it the way a man names a diagnosis he has long suspected and finally seen confirmed. I've had my own notes gathering dust these 20 years, miss. Same as I told you at Fenbridge. I never thought I'd see the day they might finally be worth something to somebody. What notes, sir? Come in out of this rain first, and I'll tell you what I can, though I think there's a better place than a posting inn's parlor to finish the telling. Something in his expression had shifted toward a private certainty Verity did not yet understand. Your mother's cottage, miss. The old gardener's place at Farley. I believe I know what your mother hid there, the night she ran, and I believe it's past time someone went and found it properly. How could you know that, sir? My father shot a horse that night, miss, for a woman traveling alone with an infant, in weather nearly as poor as this. He never learned her name, nor asked it a smith in those days, learned not to ask too many questions of frightened travelers passing through in the dark. But he told me once, years after, that she'd stopped first at the old Deverill gardener's cottage, before she came to him, near 2 hours later than the distance alone should have taken her, and came away considerably lighter of whatever she'd been carrying when she arrived. I thought nothing of it as a boy. I have thought a great deal more of it since, especially this past fortnight, turning over everything your Grace and Miss Marsh have already found. They rode together the remaining distance to Farley Hall's grounds, Combe insisting on lending Verity his own horse while he walked alongside, an arrangement neither of them fully trusted his leg to manage, but which he refused, with the particular stubbornness of an old soldier, to reconsider. The storm had not eased by the time they reached the old oaks, and the green door of the cottage stood exactly as Verity remembered it from her very first week at Farley Hall, battered now by wind and rain, swinging loose on one hinge, as though the house itself had finally given up trying to keep its secret closed. Inside, the cottage smelled of damp stone and long neglect, rain finding its way through a gap in the roof to patter steadily against the floorboards near the cold hearth. It was there, at Combe's direction, his father's old account had named the hearth specifically, the one detail the smith had remembered clearly enough to repeat, that Verity knelt and began prying at the boards with a strength she had not known grief and fury together could lend her. The board came up more easily than she expected, the wood beneath it soft with 2 decades of damp. Beneath lay a rusted tin box, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and brittle, exactly the shape and weight of 20 years' careful hiding. She worked the oilcloth open, with fingers gone clumsy from cold and rain, and found within a small collection of letters, tied with a ribbon rather sturdier than the one that had guarded Cecilia's note in the library, along with a folded scrap that proved, on unfolding, to be a receipt of sorts, a note in an unfamiliar hand acknowledging £50 to be conveyed to S.M. upon her safe removal from the county, dated the same week as the assize record's grim entry, and marked at its foot paid in full. Beneath the receipt lay a single letter in her mother's own hand, the ink less faded than Cecilia's, protected as it had been from light and air alike within the box's careful wrapping. My dearest Verity, it began, if you are ever reading this, then either I have found the courage at last to tell you myself, and this letter is only a keepsake, or the world has grown cruel enough to need the truth told without me. I pray it is the former. I write as though it is the latter, because hope is a poor foundation to build a warning upon. Verity's hands had begun to shake before she reached the second paragraph, though whether from cold or from the letter's contents, she could no longer entirely separate one from the other. Your father did nothing but tell the truth about a granary he had no business knowing the contents of, and paid for that honesty with his life, on the word of men who profited from the lie he exposed. I was promised money enough to take you somewhere safe, where no one would think to look for the widow of a hanged man or the daughter she carried. That money never reached my hand, though I was told it had been sent and paid and settled. I have never known, in all the years since, whether it was lost or stolen, or simply never intended to reach me at all. I have kept these letters and this receipt because I could not bring myself to destroy the only proof I possess that your father was not what the assizes called him, nor I the thief certain people would have preferred the county believe. I hid them here, in the one corner of that house that had ever shown me any real kindness, because I could not carry them safely with an infant, and a fear I no longer had the strength to outrun properly. Forgive me the hunger, my love, and the cold, and every year I let you believe your mother had simply been unlucky rather than wronged. I did not know how to give you the truth without also giving you a danger I had already spent everything I had escaping. I hope, wherever you are reading this, that the danger has finally passed. Verity read it through twice, by the light of Combe's shielded lantern, the rain still finding its way through the roof above them, and found that grief, for once, had given way entirely to something steadier and considerably less forgiving. £50, Combe said quietly, reading the receipt over her shoulder. And your mother never saw a penny of it. I'd wager my other leg, miss, that whoever wrote out that receipt is the very same steward who paid £11 to see your father hanged in the first place. We cannot prove it yet. No, Combe agreed. But I begin to think we're a good deal closer to proving it than that steward would like us to be, and closer still than he knows. He helped her to her feet, the tin box wrapped carefully back in its oilcloth and tucked beneath her cloak against the rain. Come. There's a farmhouse a mile back where the mistress owes me a kindness from the war and won't ask questions of a soaked young woman I vouch for. We'll see you dry and safe till morning, and then we'll see what his grace has managed to find on his own side of this business. Neither of them yet knew that Nathaniel, at that same hour, was tearing through his own household's records with a violence that would have startled anyone who had known him only as the composed, even-tempered duke of ordinary summers, nor that two hounds, driven half-mad by a night no one had properly explained to them, had finally broken free of a kennel latch grown careless with disuse, and were, at that very moment, somewhere out in the storm themselves. Nathaniel had gone directly from the ruin of the harvest supper to his study, too angry to trust himself in company a moment longer, and it was there that Mrs. Hollis found him some 20 minutes later, her face carrying news he understood, from her expression alone, before she spoke a word of it. She's gone, your grace, out into the storm, on foot, before I could properly argue her out of it. He was on his feet and halfway to the door, before sense caught up with impulse and stopped him. I cannot simply ride out after her blindly in this weather, with no notion which road she has taken, and Sharp still in this house, likely congratulating himself on an evening's work well done. He forced himself to stand still, breathing hard, and made himself think, rather than simply feel, for the first time since Lady Constance had risen to speak. If I am to bring her back to anything worth returning to, I need proof tonight, not tomorrow. Proof Sharp cannot argue away in front of the whole parish a second time. He went to the records room himself, rather than waiting on Wren's careful, patient inquiries, and began pulling ledgers from shelves with a thoroughness his earlier, more cautious searches had never quite risked. It was in the oldest of the estate's private account books, not the ordinary household ledger he and Verity had examined weeks before, but a slimmer volume bound in green leather, tucked behind a row of tenancy agreements where it had clearly sat undisturbed for the better part of 2 decades, that he found what Wren's inquiries had not yet managed to surface. A single entry, dated within days of the assize record's grim conclusion, recorded a withdrawal of £50 from the Duchess's private charitable account for the stated purpose of provision for S.M. and dependent, to be conveyed upon her safe removal from the county. Beneath it, where the recipient's receipt of the sum ought to have been countersigned, a name had been struck through with such violence that the pen had torn the paper clean across a single black line, dragging through letters, just barely still legible beneath the damage. Nathaniel held the page close to the candle, turning it at an angle until the torn ink resolved itself, by slow and unwilling degrees, into a shape he recognized. Oh, Sharp. He sat back slowly, the pieces arranging themselves with a clarity that felt in the moment almost physically painful. His mother's torn letter, found weeks before in her old writing desk. I have tried these 3 days to find the courage to write this properly, and find I cannot, though I know now that I must. The torn fragment had never named its intended recipient in full, but Nathaniel understood now, with a certainty that turned his stomach, precisely whose name that single letter had begun. His mother had suspected. Perhaps not everything, perhaps not the assize record, nor the 11 pounds, nor whatever precise mechanism had turned a whistleblowing miller into a hanged man 20 years before, but she had suspected enough, in her final year, to begin a letter to Obadiah Sharp himself, or perhaps to someone else entirely about him, and had lost either the courage or the time to finish it before illness took the choice away from her altogether. He went that same hour to the old sitting room and retrieved the torn fragment from where he had left it, and laid it beside the ledger's damaged entry, and found the 2 pieces of evidence, one his mother's unfinished suspicion, one Sharp's own violent effort to erase his name from a transaction he had never intended anyone to trace, confirmed each other with a completeness that left no honest room for doubt. Ajax and Hector found him there some minutes later, having broken free of whatever had kept them from the barn's chaos, soaked through and wild-eyed, scratching at the records room door with a violence that Nathaniel had never once seen from either of them before. He let them in without hesitation, and Ajax went directly to the desk, nose working at the green ledger, with an intensity that felt, in that overwrought hour, like confirmation rather than coincidence, though Nathaniel understood, even as he watched it, that the Hound was very likely following nothing more mysterious than old dust and older paper, the same patient, uncomplicated instinct that had first drawn both animals to Verity's mother's scent, years before either dog had been born, passed down through whatever quiet training a kennel remembers longer than any single hound's own lifetime. It did not feel like coincidence. It felt, in that moment, like the whole house finally agreeing with what he now knew to be true. He rode out within the half hour, Ajax and Hector loping alongside his horse through a storm that showed no sign of relenting, the ledger and the torn letter both secured against the rain inside his coat, and did not slacken his pace until the lights of a farmhouse some miles down, the Fenbridge road, came into uncertain view through the downpour. A farmhouse where, though he could not yet have known it, Corporal Ezekiel Combe had already brought Verity Marsh safely in out of the storm, with a tin box of her own held just as carefully against the same relentless rain. He found her within, wrapped in a borrowed shawl before the farmhouse's modest fire, Combs standing sentinel nearby, with the tin box's contents spread across a rough wooden table between them. She looked up at his entrance with an expression that held more wariness than relief, and Nathaniel understood in that instant precisely how badly the evening's public accusation had cost her, how little reason she had yet been given to trust that anything had truly changed since she walked out into the storm. "I have proof," he said, before she could speak, before pride or caution could stop either of them from saying what needed saying. "My mother suspected him, Verity. She began a letter naming him and never finished it. And there is an entry in her own private ledger, 50 pounds withdrawn for your mother's safe removal, with Sharp's own name scratched out where his receipt of it should have stood plain." Verity's hand went, without her quite deciding it should, to the tin box before her. 50 pounds. That is the exact sum my mother wrote of in the letter she left in the cottage. Money promised and never received. Then between the 2 of us, Nathaniel said, we have rather more than a suspicion now. Combe cleared his throat, in the manner of a practical man who had watched enough reunions, on battlefields and off them, to know precisely when a room needed steering back toward useful business. "Begging your pardons both, but I'd say what you have, between the 2 of you, is a case fit for the magistrate's ears come morning, and precious little time left to prepare it properly, if you mean to lay it before him at Fenbridge, before Sharp has any chance to hear how the wind's turned and run for it." Neither Nathaniel nor Verity argued the point, though it was some minutes yet before either of them managed to look away from the other long enough to properly attend to it. The hearing was convened the following morning at the Fenbridge court, before Sir Jocelyn Ashdown, justice of the peace for the district, a heavy-set man of methodical temperament who had presided over enough disputes among the county's gentry and tenantry alike to have developed a settled distrust of dramatic accusations unaccompanied by dramatic proof. Word had traveled faster than either Nathaniel or Verity anticipated. By the time their small party arrived, Nathaniel, Verity, Combe, and Wren, summoned by urgent letter and arrived from Norwich only an hour before, his dry composure for once showing signs of genuine haste, a considerable crowd had already gathered outside the court, drawn by the previous evening's gossip and swollen further by tenants from Sedgefen who had heard, through channels no one could quite trace, that the matter concerned rather more than one maid's private disgrace. Sharp arrived separately, composed as ever, Lady Constance and her father a careful distance behind him, and took his place before the magistrate with the same mild, unhurried bearing he had worn through every account book and every garden conversation since Verity's first week at Farley Hall. Sir Jocelyn was known throughout the district as a man who had earned his position through decades of unglamorous diligence rather than birth or favor, the younger son of a Fenbridge wool merchant who had studied law by candlelight and never quite lost the plain, no-nonsense manner of the trade he had left behind. It was, Nathaniel reflected as the man took his seat, precisely the sort of magistrate least likely to be swayed by a duke's rank on one side of a dispute or a steward's respectable manner on the other, and precisely the sort the morning's business most required. "Your Grace," Sir Jocelyn said, once the room had settled, "you have requested this hearing in some haste, and on a matter I confess arrives before me in a rather more tangled state than my clerk's summary could fully untangle. I would ask that whatever is presented be presented plainly and in order for the benefit of this court and the good people who have troubled themselves to attend it." Nathaniel laid the matter out as plainly as he could, managed the ledger entry naming Susanna Marsh as companion to his mother, the letter of gratitude found in the library, the assize record from 20 years past naming Elias Marsh, and the £11 paid toward his prosecution, and finally the Green account book's withdrawal of £50, its recipient's name violently obscured, and his mother's own unfinished letter, beginning with a single damning initial. Sharp's composure held through nearly all of it, breaking only slightly a tightening at the jaw, no more when the green ledger was laid before the magistrate and its torn entry examined by Sir Jocelyn's own clerk. A torn signature proves nothing. "Your Grace," Sharp said, when invited to answer. "Ink smears. Pages tear with age and handling. I cannot account for every accident that has befallen a 20-year-old ledger, and I would remind this court that Miss Marsh has already once been discovered attempting to force my private papers, a fact this court might reasonably weigh against the character of anyone bringing further accusations on her behalf." It was, Verity thought, watching him, precisely the same maneuver he had used the night before turning her own desperate mistake into a shield for his own conduct, and she understood, with a steadiness that surprised her, that the moment had come to answer it herself, rather than let Nathaniel or Wren carry the whole weight of her defense alone. "Might I speak, sir?" she asked, and Sir Jocelyn, after a measuring glance, inclined his head. "I forced that lock because I had already found evidence, through entirely proper channels, that this house paid to see my father hanged, and I could find no one willing to explain why, through any channel considered proper enough for a maid to use." Her voice carried further than she expected it to, reaching, she suspected, very nearly to the crowd gathered outside the open door. "I do not deny the mistake, sir, nor ask this court to overlook it. I ask only that my one poor decision, made in grief, not be weighed as equal to 20 years of a steward's careful theft, nor allowed to excuse it." A murmur moved through the room, though this one, Verity noted, carried rather less of the previous evening's cruel curiosity, and rather more of something that might, cautiously, have been called sympathy. It was Combe who delivered what proved, in the end, the most difficult testimony for Sharp to answer. He described, in the same plain, matter-of-fact manner he had used at Fenbridge weeks before, his father's account of a frightened woman traveling with an infant, stopping first at the Farley gardener's cottage, before continuing on into the night, an account he had never before given any formal weight, until a tin box buried beneath that same cottage's hearth for 20 years had surfaced letters confirming every particular of it. "I've no personal quarrel with Mr. Sharp, sir," Combe told the magistrate. "I'd rather have found nothing at all, if I'm honest, and lived out my days thinking a boy's uneasy memory of a hanging was nothing more than a boy's uneasy nerves. But I did find something, and a soldier learns, if nothing else in 12 years' service, not to look away from a plain fact, simply because looking away would be more comfortable for everyone concerned." A murmur of assent moved through the tenant families, gathered at the back of the room when Combe finished speaking, and one voice, the widow Ackroyd's, unmistakable, even hushed, was heard to add, to no one in particular, that Mr. Sharp's granary arithmetic had never once added up the same way twice in living memory, which drew a sharp look from the bailiff, but no formal objection from anyone with the standing to silence it. Sir Jocelyn examined the tin box's contents himself, the receipt, Susanna's letter, the Assizes record Combe had brought along from the court's own files, turning each document over with the slow, deliberate thoroughness of a man determined not to be moved by sympathy before he had properly weighed the evidence sympathy was responding to. "Mr. Sharp," he said finally, "I find myself with a torn ledger entry bearing your name beneath it. A receipt for £50 your own steward's accounts confirm was withdrawn but apparently never delivered, and testimony from a court usher of unimpeachable service connecting your name to a prosecution 20 years past, that this same evidence now suggests was a good deal less straightforward than the original verdict recorded. I do not say this proves every particular of what has been alleged against you today. I say it proves more than a torn page and an old man's fading memory, and considerably more than I am prepared to dismiss on the strength of your composure alone." He turned to his clerk. "I am satisfied there is sufficient cause to commit Mr. Sharp for examination before the next assizes, on charges touching the original prosecution of Elias Marsh, the disposition of funds entrusted to his care, and such further matters as a fuller investigation of his private accounts may yet reveal. Bailiff, you will see him held pending that examination." For one moment, Sharp's composure failed him completely. A flash of something cornered and ugly crossing features that had for 20 years worn nothing but mild reasonableness in front of the household he had so thoroughly deceived. It passed as quickly as it came, and he allowed himself to be led out with his hands folded before him still, as though even his arrest might yet be conducted according to proper form. Lady Constance did not wait to see the rest. She was gone from the courtroom before the bailiff had finished speaking, her father a pace behind her, and Nathaniel understood, watching them go, that whatever arrangement had bound the Farrow family to Sharp's grain venture would very shortly become the county's newest and least forgiving subject of gossip. In an ironic reversal, Verity, watching them leave, found she could not much mourn. Lord Farrow paused only once, at the courtroom door, to offer Nathaniel a single stiff, unhappy bow. "I knew nothing of the hanging, your grace, whatever else I am guilty of this summer. I would have you believe that much, if nothing else." "I am a good deal more concerned, my lord, with what you did know," Nathaniel replied, "than with what you did not. It was not unkind, precisely, though it was not forgiving either, and Lord Farrow seemed to accept it as exactly the answer his conduct had earned, offering no further defense before following his daughter out into the dispersing crowd." Sir Jocelyn addressed the room once more before rising. "Let the record show that Elias Marsh's original conviction is called into serious question by evidence presented this day, and that this court recommends the matter be formally reviewed, with a view toward clearing his name and that of his widow. Upon the fuller examination the next assizes will provide." It was not, Verity understood, a full pardon delivered on the spot. The law, even roused to sympathy, moved by its own slow and deliberate season, much like the harvest itself. But it was enough, spoken aloud in a crowded courtroom before half of Sedgefan's assembled tenants, to feel, for the first time in 20 years, like the beginning of an ending rather than merely another silence. Among the tenant families gathered outside, the old woman in the lavender shawl who had once told Verity, in a cottage doorway weeks before, that she had the look of someone, pushed her way slowly to the front of the dispersing crowd. and took Verity's hand in both her own weathered ones before anyone could properly introduce them. Susanna Marsh's girl, she said, with the satisfaction of a puzzle, finally solved after 20 years of nagging at the edges of an old woman's memory. I knew it the moment I saw you walk past my door. Your mother had just such a way of standing, like she expected the world to knock her down and had already decided she wouldn't fall properly when it tried. She patted Verity's hand once, firmly, and released it. She'd be glad to see this day, whatever else the years took from her first. Verity found she could not immediately answer that, and did not in the end need to. The old woman had already turned to share the news with her neighbors, and the moment passed into the general, warm confusion of a crowd that had, for once that summer, something worth celebrating rather than merely enduring. Outside, in the weak morning sun that had finally broken through after the night's storm, Ajax and Hector waited exactly where Nathaniel had left them, and greeted Verity's emergence from the courthouse with an enthusiasm that scattered half the dispersing crowd and drew, from several of the watching tenant families, the first unguarded laughter Farley Hall's business had produced among them in a very long while. Nathaniel called the household together that same evening, in the long hall where the harvest supper's wreckage had scarcely been cleared, and said, before the assembled staff of Farley Hall, what he had not managed to say clearly enough the night before, when saying it clearly might have spared Verity the worst of the storm altogether. Miss Marsh's position as keeper of my hounds is restored, effective this hour, along with whatever trust in this household her own conduct has always deserved, and this house too slowly extended her. He did not raise his voice, though the hall was silent enough that he had no particular need to. I will say plainly what I ought to have said. Plainly, a fortnight ago, the fault in this business belonged solely to Mr. Sharp, and to those who found it convenient to let an old injustice remain buried rather than disturb a steady man's comfortable arrangements. It did not belong to Miss Marsh, nor to her mother, nor to her father, whose name this court has this day begun to clear. Cook, from somewhere near the back of the assembled staff, was heard to observe, in a whisper not nearly as private as she perhaps intended, that she had always known Mrs. Marsh's daughter was a woman of consequence, which drew a startled, exhausted laugh from Verity that did more to ease the evening's remaining tension than any formal speech could have managed alone. You said I was mutton thief bait. Not 3 months past, Verity reminded her. I said the dogs likely mistook you for mutton, Cook corrected, with the particular dignity of a woman revising history in real time. I never said a word against your character, Miss Marsh, and I'll thank you to remember the distinction. The assizes, when they convened some weeks later, confirmed everything the Fenbridge hearing had already begun to unravel. Sharp's private accounts, examined in full by men a good deal less patient with his composure than the county's ordinary business had ever required him to be, revealed a pattern of embezzlement stretching back to within a year of the old Duke's death, small sums at first, growing steadily bolder across 2 decades of unchecked trust, capped by the grain venture with the Earl of Faro that had very nearly, in its final desperate summer, driven both men to a fraud far larger than either had yet managed to commit. Elias Marsh's conviction was formally set aside, his name entered into the parish record, beside a brief, dry note of the court's regret, dry, but sufficient, and more than Verity had ever dared hope for in the years before that summer. They found, with Combs' help, the plain corner of the Fenbridge churchyard where the parish had buried Elias Marsh 20 years before, in a grave that had never carried so much as a headstone to mark whose rest it disturbed. Nathaniel arranged, before the year was out, for a modest stone to be set there, carved simply with a name and 2 dates and a single line. Verity chose herself, he told the truth, and was not believed in time. It is not much, she said, standing before it, on the day the mason finished his work, against 20 years of silence. It is a good deal more than a scratched-out name in a ledger, Nathaniel said, which is what the county was prepared to leave him with before this summer. She found she could not much disagree with that, and stood a while longer in the quiet churchyard, her hand in his, before either of them felt ready to leave. Combe, waiting a respectful distance off with his hat in his hands, fell into step beside them as they walked back toward the horses, and said nothing at all for the better part of a mile, which Verity had learned, by then, was very often the truest kindness the old soldier knew how to offer. The Earl of Pharaoh's part in the grain venture cost him far more than the profit he had hoped to gain from it, a formal censure from his fellow magistrates, and a season of drawing-room gossip a good deal less forgiving than anything Verity herself had endured, though Nathaniel found he could summon no great satisfaction in the symmetry of it. Lady Constance left the county altogether before the year was out, for an aunt's household in Bath, and was not spoken of again at Farley Hall beyond the occasional carefully neutral inquiry, Mrs. Hollis made a point of shutting down whenever it arose. Corporal Combe was offered, and after some consideration accepted, a position as Farley Hall's new land agent's clerk, a step down in formal rank from his court duties at Fenbridge, but a considerable step up, as he told Nathaniel with characteristic bluntness, in the quality of the company and the reliability of the pay. "I've had my fill of other men's old business at that court, your grace," he said. "I find I'd rather help build something honest than keep filing away the wreckage of what wasn't." Bartholomew Wren, for his part, declined Nathaniel's half-serious offer of a permanent post nearer Farley Hall, observing dryly that a solicitor who moved close enough to his clients to dine with them regularly generally lost the detachment that made him useful to them in the first place. He continued to manage the family's affairs from Norwich, as he always had, though he made a point, from that year forward, of visiting Farley Hall more often than strict business required, and never once, in all the years following, failed to ask after the Hounds by name. Verity found Nathaniel in the cottage some weeks after the assizes had closed, the green door repaired at last and hung properly on its hinges, the floorboards where the tin box had waited 20 years replaced with new, unweathered wood. He had taken to sitting there some evenings, he admitted, when the house's ordinary business grew too heavy for the study to hold comfortably. "I keep thinking of her here," he said, without needing to name which mother he meant, since both by then had earned equal claim to the thought. "Waiting, hoping someone would come looking eventually, even if she could not have known it would take 20 years. She would be glad to know it was your mother's letter that helped end it, that both of them found their voice again in different broken sentences, 20 years apart." Verity settled beside him on the cottage's newly swept hearth. "I used to think my mother's caution was simply her nature. I understand now it was a wound dressed so carefully I mistook the bandage for the whole of her. I understand my own mother a good deal better now too," Nathaniel said, "and like her the more for the understanding, even knowing how much she left unsaid to me besides." They sat a while in a silence that had by then very little grief left in it, and a great deal more of something settled and companionable, the kind of quiet two people earn only by having weathered the loud part of a story together first. "I have been considering," Nathaniel said eventually, "how precisely to ask you something, without a great deal of ceremony to spoil it, or Ajax to interrupt it. You have already asked me a great many things this summer, without much ceremony at all, your grace. I don't know that I'd trust it, coming from you dressed up formally now. Then I shall have to find some suitably undignified way to ask it after all," he said, and did not, in the end, ask it that particular afternoon, though the asking, when it finally came some weeks later, surprised neither of them nearly so much as the flower did. Farley Hall changed, in the months that followed, in ways both large and small. A new steward was engaged, a careful, unglamorous man named Whitlock, who kept far less private capital than his predecessor and far more transparent books. The estate's charitable provisions were reorganized under a fund Nathaniel established in his mother's name, and, at his particular insistence, in Elias and Susanna Marsh's names, as well a standing provision for tenant families in hard seasons, administered with a transparency Sharp's tenure had never once permitted, and overseen, by the following spring, by Verity herself, who found she had a talent for the work that surprised no one so much as it surprised her. It was Verity who insisted the widow Ackroyd's family be among the fund's first beneficiaries, remembering the woman's tired observation about arithmetic that never added up the same way twice, and who walked out to the same cottage at the edge of Sedgefen one mild spring morning to deliver, in person, a good deal more than a basket of reduced flour ration. "The new steward keeps honest books, Mrs. Ackroyd," she said, setting down a far fuller basket than the summer before had allowed. I mean to see that they stay that way, so long as I've any say in the matter. The widow studied her a long moment, then studied the basket, and said only, "Your mother's girl, through and through," which Verity had by then learned to take as the very highest compliment the Fens knew how to offer. It was in the estate's newly repaired granary, some months after the assizes had closed the matter for good, that Nathaniel found her one crisp autumn morning, counting sacks of grain against a ledger with a thoroughness that would have done Wren himself proud. "I had meant to do this properly," he told her, "in the rose garden, with a good deal less flour involved." "Flour, your grace?" Ajax chose that precise to shoulder past him with more enthusiasm than the doorway strictly allowed, catching Nathaniel's knee and sending him stumbling directly into an open sack of the very grain Verity had been counting. A cloud of fine white dust rose up around him, settling over his dark coat and darker hair, with an indignity no duke, however composed, could fully survive with his dignity intact. Verity laughed before she could stop herself, the same short, startled sound that had first betrayed her, months before, in a chaotic kitchen full of barking hounds, and found she could not, for the life of her, stop laughing even as Nathaniel climbed to his feet, flour-dusted and faintly ridiculous, and dropped to one knee regardless, directly in the mess Ajax had made of them both. "Verity Marsh," he said, with as much dignity as a man liberally coated in flour could reasonably muster, "you came into this house half expecting to be devoured by my hounds, uncovered a fraud that had gone unpunished for 20 years, forced me to examine every comfortable assumption I had ever made about the people I trusted, and have now apparently made a considerable mess of my grain stores as well. I find I would like nothing better than for you to go on doing precisely that, for the rest of both our lives, if you would do me the honor of becoming my wife." Hector, not to be outdone by his brother's contribution to the moment, attempted to lick flour directly from Nathaniel's ear, nearly toppling him fully into the sack a second time. "Yes," Verity said, laughing still, flour settling in her hair as she knelt down beside him, rather than waiting to be properly raised to her feet first. "Yes, though I make no promises about the state of your grain stores going forward. I have learned this past year not to trust promises about tidiness from anyone in this house, four-legged or otherwise." He kissed her there, amid the flour and the barking, and the ordinary golden light of an autumn morning that owed nothing at all to the gray, hazy summer that had preceded it, and found, for the first time in longer than he could properly remember, that Farley Hall felt simply, uncomplicatedly like a home rather than merely an inheritance to be managed. Outside, the harvest that autumn had come in modest but sufficient, the county's collective held breath finally released, and somewhere in the granary behind them, Ajax and Hector settled into the flour-dusted straw together, thoroughly pleased, as they generally were, with a piece of work well done. Mrs. Hollis, informed of the engagement before the flour had even been properly swept from the granary floor, allowed herself, for perhaps the first time in Verity's acquaintance with her, an expression that was unmistakably and wholeheartedly a smile. "I did tell you to guard your heart, Miss Marsh," she said, "not to give it away completely. I see you were only ever going to manage one of those two things, whatever advice an old housekeeper troubled herself to offer. I rather think, Mrs. Hollis," Verity said, "that you knew that the day you gave it." Mrs. Hollis did not deny it, and said nothing further on the matter beyond ordering, with her usual brisk authority, that somebody see to sweeping the granary floor properly before supper.